The discovery of the Amarna letters in 1887 opened a window onto one of the most unusual and mysterious periods in ancient Egyptian history. These clay tablets preserve diplomatic correspondence sent from rulers across Western Asia and Mesopotamia to the Egyptian courts of Amenhotep III and his son Akhenaten in the 14th century before Christ. The letters revealed a complex international world of alliances, rivalries, and royal marriages, and they inspired archaeologists to search for the royal city connected with this correspondence. Soon afterward, excavations began at the desert site, now known as Amarna, the ancient city Akhenaten, founded by Akhenaten as the center of his new religious vision. From the beginning, the greatest fascination surrounded the king's radical transformation of Egyptian religion, an experiment that attracted attention not only from Egyptologists and historians, but also from scholars in other fields who tried to understand the motives behind such a dramatic break with tradition. Across the cliffs and tombs carved into the desert hills, scenes survive, showing Akhenaten and his queen Nefertiti worshipping the radiant sun disk, called the Aten. Their daughters often appear beside them, forming a royal family that is presented as uniquely close to the divine presence. In many images, the sun disk spreads its rays downward toward the royal figures, and at the end of these rays appear human hands that reach toward them, sometimes offering the symbol of life. Whether the royal family is shown praying, resting within their palaces, or travelling through the streets in chariots, the same glowing presence surrounds them. These images appeared throughout the city, even on the monumental boundary markers that defined Akhenaten as a sacred domain dedicated entirely to the Aten. Inside the tombs of officials loyal to the king, long hymns to the Aten were carved into the walls. Among these texts is a famous hymn that praises the Aten as the supreme source of life and power. The language of these hymns places the Aten above all other gods, and presents the king as the chosen intermediary through whom the divine power reached the world. Alongside this new doctrine came a harsh policy against the traditional cults, especially the worship of Amun at Thebes. Temples were closed, names were erased from monuments, and images were destroyed. This sudden rejection of long-established traditions is striking because Egyptian religion had normally absorbed new gods without abandoning older ones. For more than 1,000 years, Egyptian deities had been honoured side by side, and the idea of suppressing them entirely was almost unheard of. Something extraordinary had taken place during Akhenaten's reign, a change so sudden and so complete that it remains one of the most debated episodes in Egyptian history. Different scholars have offered various explanations for Akhenaten's actions. Some have described his reign as a religious revolution driven by philosophical ideas that had been developing among priestly circles. Others have suggested that the expansion of Egyptian power beyond its borders encouraged the growth of universal religious ideas, eventually leading to the elevation of a single supreme deity. Still others have portrayed Akhenaten as a ruler whose intense religious devotion overshadowed practical concerns and weakened the empire built by his predecessors. Some historians see him as a destructive figure who rejected too much of the past, while others view him as an original thinker with a distinctive personality who tried to reshape the spiritual life of Egypt in a new direction. Careful study of the decades before Akhenaten shows that interest in solar religion had already been increasing. The word used for the sun disk had existed for centuries and was not invented in Akhenaten's time. References to the sun disk appear in very early Egyptian texts, where deceased kings were described as ascending into the sky and joining the radiant solar power that created them. Over time, the importance of solar symbolism continued to grow, especially during the reigns of Akhenaten's father, Amenhotep III, and his predecessors. Some scholars have suggested that Amenhotep III himself was honoured as a divine being late in his life and closely associated with the solar gods. According to this interpretation, the religion promoted by Akhenaten may have been influenced by the divine status attributed to his father, and by the strong solar traditions already present in the royal court. To understand the deeper origins of the Aten religion, it is necessary to look far back into the earliest periods of Egyptian civilization. From the beginning, the brilliant sun and the clear sky dominated the landscape of the Nile Valley. The daily movement of the sun across the heavens was one of the most powerful and visible forces in nature, and it naturally became a central symbol in religion and kingship. Throughout the long history of the pharaohs, solar worship in different forms remained one of the strongest elements of Egyptian belief. The sun represented order, life, and continuity, and it seemed to reveal the presence of divine power more clearly than any other natural phenomenon. For this reason, the sun god came to occupy a position of exceptional importance in Egyptian religion, especially during the age of the pyramids, when no other cult rivaled the influence of the solar temples. The earliest centuries of Egyptian history reveal a variety of solar deities, whose names probably originated in different regions before gradually merging into a single religious tradition. One of the most important was Aten, the patron god of the ancient city, later known to the Greeks as Heliopolis, the city of the sun. Aten was often linked with the more general name Re, which referred both to the sun itself and to the passing of the day. Another solar form was Khepri, a god associated with becoming and transformation. This deity was commonly represented as a scarab beetle rolling the sun across the sky, just as a beetle pushes a ball of earth along the ground. To the Egyptians, the mysterious appearance of young beetles from these balls suggested a form of spontaneous creation, and the same idea was applied to the daily rebirth of the sun. A further expression of solar power appeared in the figure known as Re-Horakti, a fusion of the sun god Re with Horus, the falcon god of the sky. Horus was among the earliest divine figures associated with kingship and was represented as a falcon soaring high above the earth. Images of this falcon appear on some of the oldest royal monuments, where the bird stands above conquered enemies or protects the ruler. Over time, Horus became inseparable from the idea of kingship, symbolizing the divine authority of the pharaoh. Through this connection, the king himself was seen as the earthly form of Horus and the descendant of the sun god. Early religious texts often combined these different solar identities into a single system. Some passages describe the sun rising in the east as Re, travelling across the sky in another form and completing its journey as yet another aspect of the same divine power. This unity of solar forms reinforced the belief that the king shared in the nature of the sun. From the earliest dynasties, Egyptian rulers adopted a special royal name that linked them to Horus, emphasizing the belief that the king was both the son of the sun god and the living Horus on earth. Royal inscriptions often placed the king's name inside a stylized representation of the palace, above which stood the falcon of Horus as a sign of divine protection. Ancient funerary texts reveal how deeply this solar ideology shaped the concept of kingship. When a king died, he was believed to enter the company of the gods and to be welcomed as the child of the sun god. These texts describe the ruler approaching the divine realm as the son of the creator, returning to the source from which he had come. The king's divine origin was therefore not only a political idea, but also a central element of Egyptian belief about life after death. Solar theology also includes a detailed account of creation. According to these traditions, the creator god brought himself into existence before the world began. Before the sky, the earth, or humanity existed. the Creator was already present. From this original being emerged the first generation of gods who represented the fundamental forces of nature. The act of creation was imagined in vivid, physical terms, emphasizing the self-generating power of the Creator. These events were believed to have taken place at the ancient city of Heliopolis, which was regarded as the birthplace of the gods and the center of the solar cult. Central to this creation story was the belief that the first land rose out of the dark waters that existed before the world. This primeval mound was thought to be the place where the sun first shone at the beginning of time. Temples later recreated this sacred moment by placing their holiest spaces on raised ground, symbolizing the original hill of creation. Sacred stones shaped like small pyramids represented the first place where sunlight touched the earth. The shining surface of these stones reflected the brilliance of the sun and served as powerful symbols of creation. Evidence from ancient temples suggests that these symbolic mounds were reproduced in many religious centers across Egypt. Raised platforms surrounded by walls of stone or brick supported temples and marked the sacred space where the divine presence was believed to dwell. The innermost sanctuary of a temple was usually built at the highest point, reflecting the belief that this was the place closest to the moment of creation, when the sun first appeared above the waters. From the creative power of the original god came a group of major deities, who formed a sacred family associated with Heliopolis. This divine assembly represented the structure of the universe and confirmed the position of the Creator as the father of the gods. In religious tradition, the Creator stood at the head of this group, ruling over the forces that governed the natural world. Through this system of belief, the sun god became the supreme source of life and authority. Old kingdom pyramids still dominate the imagination because they were never only royal tombs. They were also stone statements about how the cosmos worked, built in a landscape where the sun's daily cycle defined time, order, and renewal. No monument makes that clearer than the earliest pyramid complex at Saqqara, the step pyramid of Djoser. It rises on some of the highest ground of the plateau, and that choice of location matters. Ancient Egyptians told a creation story in which the first dry land emerged as a mound from the dark waters at the beginning of time. By placing a royal monument on elevated terrain and shaping it into a rising, layered form, the builders could evoke that original hill of creation and the promise of regeneration. The complex around the pyramid was designed like a stage set for rituals that renewed the king's power after death, echoing ceremonies once performed during his lifetime to restore vitality and legitimacy. Yet within that same complex, solar symbolism appears in a striking, almost theatrical way. In an inner courtyard wall, a carved frieze shows cobras rearing up, as if awakening at dawn and turning toward the rising sun. These are not decorative animals chosen at random. The royal cobra was tied to the sun's burning force and to the idea of divine protection that erupts suddenly, like light breaking over the horizon. In funerary spells written for kings, the cobra is described as emerging from the sun god, and the king himself is pictured as a creature of the sky, linked to both the falcon and the solar serpent. The point is simple. Even in the very first pyramid complex, long before later sun temples and grand solar hymns, the visual language of sunlight, protection, and rebirth is already being carved into stone. During the next century, pyramid architecture changed dramatically. The stepped form evolved into the smooth-sided, true pyramid, and the new shape looked less like a stairway and more like a single, soaring, geometric body. It also resembled the sacred solar stone worshipped at Heliopolis, a symbol connected with the moment when the first light touched the first land. The greatest builders of this transformation were the kings of the fourth dynasty. Their pyramids were not only enormous, they were also named in ways that suggested brilliance, radiance, and the sun's movements across the sky. One pyramid was called Shining, another Southern Shining, and the Pyramid of Khufu at Giza carried a name that tied it to the place of sunrise and sunset. These titles were not casual labels. They advertised what the monuments were meant to do: hold the king at the boundary points of the day, where light is born and where it disappears. Why did the pyramid take this precise form? Ancient texts do not explain it directly, so the answer has to come from inference, landscape, and human experience. Anyone who has watched the sun behind clouds has seen rays break through in angled beams, forming sharp triangular shapes that seem to drop from the sky to the earth. In most early Egyptian art, those rays are not drawn. They appear much later, especially in the Aten imagery of Akhenaten. But the effect itself is timeless. In a world without electric light, where the sun was the ultimate visible power, it is easy to imagine that such beams could inspire a sacred geometry. A triangle in profile, a pyramid in space. The pyramid, then, can be understood as a frozen burst of sunlight, turned into stone. The layout of 4th Dynasty pyramid complexes strengthens that reading. The lower temple near the Nile and the upper temple beside the pyramid were typically aligned so that they faced east, and they were connected by a long causeway. That causeway was more than a road. It created a ceremonial path that carried the dead king from the edge of cultivated land toward the desert plateau and finally to the pyramid. In symbolic terms, the route traced the sun's logic, sunrise and renewal associated with the east, sunset and the realm of the dead associated with the west. This was a change from earlier royal complexes that favoured other alignments. Now, the architecture itself was arranged like a statement about the sun's course, and at Giza the sequence becomes especially clear. Valley Temple, Causeway, Pyramid Temple, Pyramid Tomb, all ordered along an east-west axis that mirrors the journey of light. Another solar form rose beside temples across Egypt for millennia, the obelisk. Tall, squared, and narrowing toward the top, it ended in a small pyramid-shaped cap. Its silhouette made the connection obvious. This was a monument that turned the idea of the sacred solar stone into a vertical beam, like a solidified shaft of sunlight. Early examples appear at Heliopolis, the ancient city most closely tied to solar worship, and that has led many researchers to see the obelisk as an outgrowth of the same tradition that inspired pyramids. There is also a compelling geographic logic here. If a towering solar monument stood at Heliopolis, it could have been visible across long distances, and from the western desert edge, the pyramid fields lay within sight lines that would connect monuments of the living cult in the east with the royal necropolis in the west. Whether or not every detail of that visual relationship can be proven, the idea captures something real. Egyptian sacred architecture often worked by creating lines, axes, and horizons that made divine order feel physically present. Obelisks did not remain an old kingdom curiosity. They became a standard feature of temple entrances, usually set up in pairs so that the space between them framed the sky like a gateway. In the New Kingdom, the scale reached astonishing heights. Some obelisks were encased in a gleaming metal alloy that flashed in the sunlight, turning the monument into an instrument of brilliance. Imagine what such surfaces would have looked like on a clear day, with the sun striking polished metal high above the temple courts. Inscriptions on these monuments speak in the language of radiance and flooding light, describing how their brightness seemed to wash over the land, as if sunlight itself had been captured and made permanent. Even the written style on some obelisks plays with solar imagery, weaving together hints of sacred birds, shining, and the ancient solar center at Heliopolis. The result is a monument that is not just tall for the sake of grandeur, but tall because height was part of the theology. The nearer to the sky, the nearer to the sun's power. Alongside pyramids and obelisks, another iconic figure carried solar meaning: the Sphinx. The colossal lion-bodied, human-headed statue at Giza is the most famous, and it likely set the pattern for later sphinxes that guarded sacred spaces. Its very existence suggests a deliberate fusion of strength and kingship. And later, tradition tied the Sphinx to solar gods. The Giza Sphinx wears the royal striped headdress, a sign of legitimate rule that appears early in Egyptian art, and becomes a standard emblem of pharaohs. Over time, the cobra of solar protection was added prominently to royal crowns, reinforcing the idea that the king carried the sun's fiery defense at his brow. The original purpose of the Giza Sphinx is still debated because its early inscriptions are missing or never existed. Even the temple structures associated with it preserve no explanatory texts. But in the New Kingdom, when the monument had already become ancient and partially buried by sand, kings returned to it and treated it as a sacred presence tied to the horizon. A chapel was built nearby and dedicated to a form of Horus connected with the horizon, a divine title that already signals sunrise, sunset, and the boundary between worlds. Royal inscriptions from this later period describe moments when a prince came to the Sphinx, paused in its shadow, and received confirmation of his future kingship. In these stories, the Sphinx speaks as a divine father and identifies itself with major solar creator forms. The prince is described as chosen, as heir, as someone who will rule because the solar power has willed it. Whatever the monument meant in the 4th dynasty, these later texts show how Egyptians ultimately understood it, as a horizon guardian, a solar being, and a witness to rightful rule. Solar imagery did not stay confined to architecture and colossal statues. It also entered the visual language of royal power in reliefs and temple scenes. In later periods, it becomes common to see a bird deity hovering above the king, or a sun disk shining overhead as a sign that divine forces protect the ruler in ritual and war. Early Egypt offers fewer surviving scenes of that type, and many Old Kingdom complexes have lost their decorative programs, so the evidence is scattered. Still, some early examples show a falcon deity above the king during ceremonial actions, and in certain scenes a circular object near the falcon's claws hints at a symbol of life or protection. Sculpture expressed the same idea in 3 dimensions, most famously in statues where a falcon's wings wrap protectively behind the king's head. What is striking is that the sun disk itself seems to become more consistently visible in this protective role later, especially from the 5th dynasty onward. Relief blocks from that era begin to show the king with a prominent solar disk placed directly above him, sometimes flanked by protective wings. The combination becomes increasingly regular in subsequent centuries. This shift matches what is known from other evidence. Solar religion was rising in prominence during the late Old Kingdom, and royal art responded by placing the sun more openly in the sky above the king, not as an abstract idea but as a clear emblem of divine backing. By this point, Egyptian visual culture had started to make solar theology explicit in the most public way possible, right above the ruler's head, carved into temple stone. On the rugged cliffs of Megara in Sinai, a carved scene of King Nusser captures royal power in its most dramatic form. The king raises his weapon to strike a kneeling desert captive, and the victim lifts a hand in a desperate plea for mercy. Above them, the sky is not left empty. The entire tableau is crowned by a solar emblem, a sun disk, guarded by twin cobras, its wings stretched wide as if the sun itself is hovering over the moment. A band of stars completes the upper frame, turning the relief into a miniature cosmos where the king acts under the direct gaze of the heavens. This kind of imagery becomes increasingly common from the 5th dynasty onward. The sun disk, often shown with wings, starts to appear again and again in royal art, not as background decoration, but as a statement of divine endorsement. Centuries later, the central symbol of Akhenaten's faith would also be the sun disk, and the visual habit of placing it above the king traces back to this earlier age when solar religion stood at its height. If Akhenaten was looking for a golden past to imitate, this era offered exactly that. The sun enthroned over kingship, and kingship presented as the sun's chosen instrument. The 4th dynasty had already produced the greatest pyramids ever built. Those massive monuments at Dahshur and Giza were not only engineering triumphs, but also unmistakable signs of a state at peak confidence. The pyramids of Sneferu, Khufu, and Khafre project a kind of certainty that is hard to miss. Resources centralized, labor organized, authority unquestioned. Yet after this high point, the scale begins to shift. Menkaur's pyramid, the 3rd at Giza, is notably smaller than the first two. And even though there was an effort to elevate its prestige by using fine stone for its casing, the change in ambition had already started to show. The transition becomes even clearer under Shepseskaf, the last ruler of the 4th dynasty, who broke with the pattern entirely. Instead of a pyramid, his burial monument took the form of a colossal stone mastaba, a broad, low structure that still required immense labor but deliberately avoided direct comparison with the towering silhouettes of Giza. Its placement farther south, away from the shadow of the earlier giants, feels like a careful decision. Build something impressive, but not in a way that invites a humiliating contrast. With the 5th dynasty, the decline in pyramid size and construction quality becomes hard to ignore. The pyramids still existed, but they no longer dominated the desert in the same way. This architectural shift runs alongside signs that the prestige of the royal office was changing too. The first king of the new dynasty, Userkaf, is a figure whose background has long raised questions. Later tradition tried to solve the legitimacy problem with a powerful story, a tale in which the founders of the 5th dynasty are presented as children of the sun god himself. The narrative is set in the earlier royal court, filled with dramatic scenes of prophecy, secret knowledge, and divine intervention. Whether every detail belongs to the time it describes is impossible to prove, but the point of the story is crystal clear. It insists that the new kings did not merely inherit Egypt. They were chosen by the solar deity who stood above all kings. In the tale, a wise man is brought before King Khufu and questioned about hidden knowledge stored in a sacred place. The sage refuses to reveal it directly and predicts that the information will eventually come to the king through the eldest of 3 children soon to be born. Their mother is described as the wife of a priest of the sun god. The revelation hits like a thunderclap. 3 future kings will be born who are not Khufu's descendants. The story then shifts to the birth itself. Divine figures associated with childbirth arrive as attendants, guiding the delivery like a ritual staged by the gods. One by one, the infants are born, and their names are announced as if destiny is being read aloud. The message is deliberate and political. The 5th dynasty is not a break in legitimacy, but a continuation guaranteed by the sun god's own paternity. Even if modern scholarship debates the historical value of such a legend, it explains how Egyptians could frame a dynastic transition without admitting weakness. If the king is the son of the sun, then any new line can be made legitimate by claiming the same divine origin. Material evidence supports the idea that a royal connection bridged the dynasties, likely through a powerful woman linked to the Giza court. Her monumental tomb stands in a key position near the Great Causeways, and later generations treated her as a figure of exceptional importance. In that setting, the divine birth story functions like an ideological seal stamped over uncertainty. It tells the audience that the solar creator has confirmed the new order. The foundation of authority is shifted slightly upward. The king remains divine, but now the sun god's role is emphasized more directly than ever before. Userkaf's building program makes that shift visible in stone. His pyramid was modest and is now heavily ruined, set near the edge of the older Saqqara sacred landscape. The truly new statement was not his pyramid at all. It was a different kind of royal monument, the first major sun temple built by a pharaoh. This was a turning point. Instead of investing everything into one funerary complex centered on a pyramid, royal energy now also poured into a separate sanctuary, dedicated explicitly to the solar deity. Over the next century, several 5th dynasty kings appear to have done the same. These sun temples followed a recognizable plan. They often included a lower temple, a long causeway, and an upper temple, echoing the structure of a pyramid complex. But where a pyramid would normally rise, a different solar marker took center stage. A massive stone feature shaped like a truncated obelisk or a stylized sacred solar stone. The design makes the message unmissable. The sun cult was no longer only implied through names, alignments, and symbolism. It now demanded its own monumental stage. The inspiration for these sanctuaries points back to Heliopolis, Egypt's ancient center of solar worship. In that city, the sacred solar stone and its related forms were treated as physical anchors of creation and light. The 5th dynasty temples seem to have translated that idea into royal architecture on the desert edge. Even when the ruins are fragmentary, the concept remains visible. Inscriptions preserve the names of these temples, and their very titles proclaim devotion to the sun god. Titles of priests and officials linked to these sanctuaries show that they were not symbolic gestures, but functioning institutions with staff, rituals, and economic support. Only 2 of these sun temples have been securely identified in the landscape. One connected to Userkaf and another, better preserved, linked to New Ser at Abu Ghurab. The rest are known by name but have not been found, destroyed by time, or still hidden beneath later layers. Yet the surviving examples are enough to reconstruct the basic plan and to understand how worship was performed there. Excavation has revealed open courtyards designed for sunlight, altars positioned before the main solar monument, and installations that point to sacrifice and offering. At New Ser's temple, the altar is shaped in a way that fits solar symbolism, and nearby areas include spaces clearly used for processing animals. Stone blocks with carved circular basins were discovered, likely used in sacrificial rites, with raised details around the rims that may have echoed the idea of radiance. Whatever the exact symbolism of every carved element, the overall function is certain. This was a place where ritual activity honoured the sun god through offerings, carried out in the open air, directly under the sky. The greatest puzzle is not what these temples were, but why they appear so intensely in this one period. Why did this practice emerge in the 5th dynasty and then fade away? One simple explanation points to economics and power. The 5th dynasty, kings built smaller pyramids than their 4th dynasty predecessors, and maintaining large temples alongside a royal pyramid complex required enormous resources. As royal authority gradually became less absolute, and as wealth and influence spread more widely across elites and provincial administration, the state may have lost the capacity to sustain both kinds of massive projects at the same level. Under that pressure, a costly tradition could easily shrink, change, or vanish. But economics alone does not fully explain the timing. Solar religion had been important earlier, and 4th Dynasty kings already incorporated solar language and symbolism into names and ideology. The sun temples may represent a further step. Solar worship had become so dominant that it required independent monumental spaces rather than being folded into the funerary complex alone. In this view, the temples are not random experiments, but architectural proof that the solar cult had reached a new level of institutional strength. The king still mattered, but the sun god now demanded more visible, more public, and more specialized structures. There is also a landscape argument that adds a fascinating layer. Egypt's sacred geography was never accidental. Sightlines, horizons, and alignments mattered. Some have suggested that the placement of certain sun temples was chosen to maintain a visual relationship with the great solar center at Heliopolis. The idea is simple. A temple built at the right point on the West Bank could keep the solar sanctuary of Heliopolis within view, tying royal ritual space in the necropolis to the oldest solar holy place in the East. If true, it would mean that 5th Dynasty kings were not merely building new temples, but stitching together sacred points across the Nile Valley into a single solar map. Not every known temple location fits perfectly into this theory, and many sites remain undiscovered. But the concept fits an Egyptian mindset that treated the horizon itself as part of religion. Another line of thought sees politics behind the architectural changes. In the 4th Dynasty, the pharaoh's power reached a level that seemed almost limitless, expressed most clearly in the vast pyramids of Giza. In the 5th Dynasty, that absolutism appears to soften. The appearance of sun temples can be read as a shift in emphasis. Not the king above everything, but the sun god's cult, rising into greater public prominence. In that reading, the building of major solar sanctuaries is not simply devotion. It is an adjustment in the balance between royal authority and divine authority, a cultural recalibration expressed through stone. It is no accident that one early sun temple carried a name that sounded like a fortress, as if announcing that a new religious center of gravity had been secured and made unassailable. Reliefs from Nusair's sun temple add another clue. They show the king performing renewal rituals that were traditionally associated with maintaining kingship and vitality. When those scenes are placed inside a solar sanctuary on the desert edge, the meaning deepens. The pyramid complex already helped the king move toward rebirth and divine status after death. The Sun Temple may have served a parallel purpose within the cosmic story itself. The West was where the sun disappeared each evening, where it seemed to die and where it had to be renewed to rise again. A solar sanctuary in the necropolis region could be interpreted as a ritual mechanism for that renewal. A place where offerings and ceremonies supported not only the king's transformation but also the daily rebirth of the sun. Religious texts, royal names, and official titles increasingly place the sun at the center of power. Monumental architecture echoes the same message, from Heliopolis and its ancient solar symbols, to pyramids, obelisks, sacred solar stones, and the dedicated sun sanctuaries of the Old Kingdom. Royal imagery reinforces it again and again through protective cobras, the sun disk, and hybrid guardian forms that blend kingship with the language of light. By the late 4th Dynasty, solar theology was no longer one strand among many. It was becoming a dominant framework for explaining why the king ruled and how the universe stayed in balance. In the 5th Dynasty, this movement reached its clearest and most confident expression, to the point that the sun god functioned almost like an official divine emblem of the state itself. This was the moment when solar religion did not merely influence the court. It shaped the public face of kingship and the monumental landscape of Egypt. From this perspective, the Fifth Dynasty can be understood as a true high point of solar rule, an era when the sun's authority was projected through temples, rituals, and ideology with extraordinary consistency. That helps explain why, a millennium later, Akhenaten's experiment feels less like a sudden invention and more like an attempted revival with a radical twist. His sun-centered faith did not emerge from a vacuum. It resembles an intentional return to an older, idealized age, followed by a bold effort to push the concept further than previous kings had dared. Earlier, solar religion elevated the sun above other gods in practice and prestige. Yet it usually remained within a world where many divine powers could exist. Akhenaten appears to have looked back to that earlier solar age, then tried to reshape it into something stricter and more exclusive. The Old Kingdom, however, did not last forever. Near the end of the Sixth Dynasty, the long reign of Pepi II marked a turning point that many later Egyptians remembered as the end of an era. Ancient king lists and later historical traditions give him an exceptionally lengthy reign, and even without agreeing on the exact number of years, the basic reality is clear. He ruled for so long that the later portion of his reign must have unfolded under conditions of age, weakness, and diminishing control. As the king aged, the centre could not hold as firmly as before. Powerful regional elites were already rising, and local officials began to behave less like servants of a distant court, and more like rulers of their own territories. When the monarch's authority weakened, fragmentation became easier. Egypt's political structure, built around the idea of a single divine king maintaining order, became vulnerable to splintering. Environmental stress likely intensified the crisis. The Nile was the artery of the entire economy, and when its flood levels dropped over multiple years, the consequences could cascade. Agriculture suffered. Food supplies tightened. Economic pressure increased. In a state that relied on surplus to maintain massive building projects, fund temples, feed labour forces and support officials, prolonged hardship could expose cracks already forming in the political system. These factors contributed to what is commonly called the First Intermediate Period, a time when multiple claimants could emerge, rival courts formed, and civil conflict became possible. The breakdown in central authority did more than change politics. It also reduced the amount of clear documentation. Monumental construction slowed dramatically, and the written record becomes thinner. For modern historians, this produces a frustrating gap. Fewer contemporary voices, fewer inscriptions, fewer building programs to anchor events in time. Later sources speak about this era, but later, memory can exaggerate, simplify, and dramatize. Some Middle Kingdom texts paint the crisis in dark, almost apocalyptic tones, describing a land in which leadership is divided and prosperity collapses. The imagery sometimes includes a cosmic dimension, as if the natural world itself no longer behaves as it should. When such literature speaks of the sun withdrawing or the day losing its normal rhythm, it can be read as metaphor as much as literal claim. In Egyptian thought, the stability of society and the stability of the cosmos were linked. The creator deity established the correct order of the world, and the king, as the divine heir of that creator, was expected to preserve justice, harmony, and proper ritual. When the country descended into disorder, it could be described as the triumph of chaos over the intended structure of existence. In that framework, a disrupted sun is not merely weather or astronomy. It symbolizes a deeper failure, the collapse of the moral and political order the king was meant to protect. Some prophetic-style compositions make the connection even sharper by implying that Egypt's troubles were tied to broken cultic life. especially at ancient solar centres. When a text laments the loss of Heliopolis as a functioning sacred heart of the land, it is doing more than describing a damaged city. It is suggesting that the world's balance has been neglected. The solution offered in such works often takes the form of a restorer, king who rises from the south, takes the full insignia of united Egypt, defeats enemies, repairs borders, and returns order to its rightful place. The name given to this saviour figure points toward a real historical ruler who would later be credited with restoring stability and rebuilding state power. The narrative is both political and theological. The king rescues the land because restoring order is the king's sacred duty. Other literary works from roughly the same broad tradition describe social reversal and economic breakdown in vivid detail. They complain of trouble with farming and the Nile, of declining prosperity, of the loss of long-distance trade that once brought luxury goods from the coast and the islands, and of social norms turned upside down. Some lines claim that royal tombs were violated and that the symbols of kingship were stolen, as if the very authority that once protected Egypt had been stripped away. These themes resonate with the idea that in times of weak government, even the most sacred spaces could be looted. Whether every poetic detail is literal is less important than the overall picture. The texts reflect an Egyptian memory of a world that had lost its anchors. Importantly, this sense of crisis is not confined to later imagination. Autobiographical inscriptions of powerful regional governors from the period describe famine relief, emergency measures, and self-presentation as saviours of their districts. One governor, writing proudly about his deeds, describes feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, supplying essentials that had become scarce, and keeping people from wandering between districts in search of food. Such inscriptions use the language of achievement and can include exaggeration, but they match what is expected in a fragmented landscape. Local strongmen filling the vacuum left by a weakening centre. The presence of multiple independent officials claiming responsibility for survival and stability strongly suggests that hardship and political decentralisation were not simply fictional themes. They were experiences that required management, and they left traces in the way local leaders described themselves. Out of fragmentation, two major power blocks emerged. In the north, a court formed around a city not far from the old Memphite heartland. In the south, Thebes began to rise from relative obscurity. This was not inevitable. Thebes had not been one of the great royal capitals of the Old Kingdom. Yet during the crisis it grew in stature, partly because its rulers could consolidate the surrounding region and present themselves as restorers of order. Northern rulers also produced respected literature and administrative traditions, and funerary practices developed in important ways across both zones. Even as central unity failed, cultural life did not vanish. It adapted, often in regional forms. One particularly revealing text takes the form of a king instructing his heir. Embedded within practical advice is an unusually frank admission that a grave wrong had been committed during warfare in a sacred burial region. The speaker describes how tombs were damaged in conflict, acknowledges that such destruction was evil and futile, and even speaks of retribution that followed. In most periods, Egyptian kings do not admit failures or wrongdoing openly. Royal inscriptions tend to frame events as triumphs, even when reality was messier. That is why a confession stands out. It suggests that the memory of civil conflict was strong enough that later tradition could not simply pretend it never happened. The passage also hints that the struggle between North and South was not merely political. It was fought over places loaded with meaning, and control of sacred landscapes could become a strategic goal. Thebes steadily expanded. Its rulers reclaimed full royal titles that had deep roots in earlier ideology, projecting themselves not as local princes but as legitimate kings of all Egypt. Evidence points to early building activity at Karnak, where a sanctuary associated with a Theban god began to take shape. Theban power pushed northward to seize key regions, including Abydos, an ancient burial centre revered since the earliest days of Egyptian kingship. Abydos was not just a dot on the map. It carried memory, legitimacy, and sacred prestige. Whoever controlled it could claim continuity with the oldest traditions of rule. Eventually, under a later Theban monarch, Egypt was reunified after years of conflict. The ruler's changing official names reflected shifting stages of his reign, and culminated in a title that celebrated the union of Upper and Lower Egypt. With this, the first intermediate period ended, and the Middle Kingdom began. Yet this reunification did not erase Thebes' new religious character. The gods associated with Thebes rose with the city, and the royal family's naming patterns reveal which deity stood nearest to their identity. A local god connected with Theban kingship gained prominence and was increasingly portrayed with solar imagery, often shown as a falcon-headed figure crowned by a sun disk. This is a crucial point. Even as political power moved and royal ideology adjusted, solar language did not disappear. It migrated, blended, and reappeared in new combinations. This Theban god's cult centre even carried a name that deliberately echoed Heliopolis, the ancient solar city. Titles applied to the place emphasised that it was an On of the south, creating a symbolic bridge between the old solar heartland and the rising Theban domain. Later, in the height of Imperial Egypt, this deity would be celebrated as a power of war, invoked to describe kings charging into battle in chariots, their strength compared to the god's might. In that later world, the connection between solar symbolism and military kingship became especially vivid. But religious history in Egypt is rarely a straight line. The deity who rose with the reunifying Theban rulers was soon overshadowed by another Theban god whose identity was defined by concealment and mystery. His name carried the sense of hiddenness, and later religious language emphasized his secret nature and elusive form. In art, he appears as a human figure with a distinctive crown of tall plumes, sometimes coloured in ways that suggest the unseen forces of the sky. The rise of this god would shape Egyptian religion for centuries, especially as Thebes became a dominant political and sacred centre. Even so, the older solar framework did not vanish. It continued to feed into new forms, merging with local traditions and reshaping itself as Egypt moved into its next great age. A striking clue to Amun's character comes not from royal monuments, but from the words of an ordinary craftsman many centuries later. In the Ramesside age, an artisan named Nebre composed a hymn describing how he felt the god's anger after committing wrongdoing. The turning point in his telling was not a grand temple ritual witnessed by crowds, but a deeply personal moment of repentance followed by a sense of release. He described forgiveness as something almost physical, the return of breath, the arrival of mercy, the god coming near through a gentle breeze. The image is perfectly suited to Amun. His very identity was tied to hiddenness, the unseen force that can still be felt. Nebre's testimony suggests that for many Egyptians, Amun was not only a theological concept, but a presence experienced through something as ordinary as wind moving across the skin. That kind of intimacy is ironic when placed beside the early evidence, because the oldest royal funerary texts hardly mention Amun at all. In the Old Kingdom, references to him are extremely rare and provide little detail. In one spell, he appears simply as a recipient of offerings, listed among other deities who receive bread. In another, a phrase about a throne of Amun appears in connection with royal ideology, a hint of a future title that would later become famous when Amun's cult reached national dominance. But in these early sources, Amun remains almost a shadow, named, yet not explained. The same puzzle continues into the next phase of funerary literature. The coffin texts, which spread widely in the First Intermediate Period and the Middle Kingdom, mention Amun only in passing. This is surprising because it is precisely during this era that Amun begins to rise in importance, especially in the south. One explanation is simple geography and tradition. These coffin spells grew out of earlier royal funerary material and stayed focused on death, protection, and the afterlife. Amun, in the earliest phases, seems to have had little connection to mortuary concerns, so he remained marginal in texts built for funerary use. Another explanation is distribution. The majority of the surviving coffin inscriptions come from Central Egypt, while relatively few originate from Thebes, where Amun's cult was gaining strength. If the texts preserved in museums today are weighted toward regions outside Amun's core homeland, it makes sense that the written record gives only faint hints of his ascent. Later, theology tried to solve the problem by inserting Amun deep into the primordial past. In some traditions, Egypt's earliest cosmic forces were imagined as a group of paired male and female beings representing the raw ingredients of creation: the primeval waters, infinite space, darkness, and the invisible air. Amun, whose name carried the idea of concealment, was linked to this primeval category as the hidden power that existed before the world took shape. Later, hymns describe him as present from the beginning, yet veiled among the first beings, concealed even from other gods. This is a clever theological move. It turns the lack of early clarity into a feature rather than a flaw. If Amun is the hidden one, then the fact that older sources do not spotlight him can be explained as part of his nature. The city most strongly connected to this concept of primeval eightfold forces lay in Middle Egypt, and the very name of that place echoed the number 8. That connection matters because it shows how Egyptian religion often worked through layering and reinterpretation. A god could rise in one region, gain political backing in another, and then be woven into older cosmologies through later reflection. In Amun's case, the ambiguity of early texts created space for later priests and poets to say, in effect, that he was always there, simply concealed. The clearest sign that Amun truly surged to the front of Egyptian religion comes in royal naming. With the founder of the 12th dynasty, Amun suddenly appears inside the king's own birth name. The name proclaims that Amun is foremost, and it was not a one-time statement. Several kings of the dynasty took the same name, repeating the claim across generations. This was not private devotion, it was a public signal, religious and political at once. Even more telling is that Amun's name begins to appear frequently among ordinary people as well. When non-royal families start naming children after a deity, it suggests the god has moved beyond court ideology and become a genuine focus of popular and elite identity. Yet the reasons behind this rise are difficult to pin down. The background of the new king is not fully clear, and the historical path by which he reached the throne remains partly obscured. Some reconstructions suggest he may have served as a high official under the previous dynasty and stepped into power when a political opening appeared. That kind of transition often demands legitimacy building, and in Egypt, legitimacy was never only political. It was cosmic. The ruler needed signs that the gods approved. A clue to this process appears in inscriptions from expeditions into the eastern desert. These records describe extraordinary events, unusual signs that were interpreted as divine favour. One famous example involves a sudden rainstorm in an arid region producing vital water for a large expedition force. Such a moment would have felt miraculous to people struggling across harsh terrain. The inscriptions present this blessing as coming from a deity whose cult centre lay north of Thebes, a god with strong associations with fertility and male potency. That deity's rituals were later woven into royal ceremonies, linked to coronation and Jubilee celebrations, aimed at strengthening the king's vitality and authority. In other words, the desert miracle tradition, the language of divine favour, and the politics of kingship were already tightly connected. What makes the 12th dynasty especially important is how these strands begin to fuse. At Karnak, one of the oldest surviving monuments from the early dynasty preserves rich evidence of changing theology. Its scenes show a solarized Amun in multiple visual forms. In some images, he appears as a traditional enthroned god, wearing the tall plumes that would become his signature. In others, he is shown in a fertility-heavy form normally associated with an older potency deity, complete with the symbolic offerings and plant imagery that accompany that cult. The most striking point is that the inscriptions identify the figure not as two separate gods, but as Amun or Amun linked with the sun. The old fertility symbolism has been absorbed into Amun's identity. An epithet appears that frames him as a powerful generative force, emphasizing virility and creative strength. The visual message is clear. Thebes is not merely promoting a local god. It is creating a composite divine power with broader reach, fertility, kingship, and the sun combined. At the same time, the dynasty did not abandon older solar centers. Building activity continued at Heliopolis, the ancient city of the sun god. A surviving obelisk from this period stands as proof that the old solar tradition remained honored. The rise of Amun did not erase the prestige of the sun god of the north. Instead, the religious direction of the 12th dynasty points toward coalescence, a southern god gaining dominance while the northern solar heritage is preserved and merged into the new national theology. That merger, Amun joined with the great solar deity, became one of the most enduring religious combinations in Egyptian history. The union makes sense on more than one level. It is theological because it connects the hidden, unseen power of air and mystery with the visible, sovereign power of the sun. It is also political because it binds Thebes, the rising southern power base, to the ancient northern heartland where the sun god's prestige had long been rooted. After a long age of division and conflict, such a synthesis could function like a religious bridge across the country. Political necessity seems to echo in royal titles of this time. The new king adopted names that emphasize calming, pacifying, and restoring balance, language that fits a society emerging from civil fracture. A later title suggests a renewal or rebirth of the nation, presenting the dynasty as the beginning of a fresh epoch, rather than a mere continuation. Another major move strengthened that message: the establishment of a new capital positioned strategically near the traditional Memphite region. It was a practical decision for controlling the north, but it also carried symbolic weight. In Egyptian thought, the place where the two halves of the country meet is not only a geographic hinge, it is a mythic balancing point, the zone where unity is imagined as being made real. Naming the new capital with a title that implies seizing or taking hold of the two lands reinforces the idea that reunification was not automatic. It required effort, authority, and perhaps force. In that setting, the fusion of Amun and the sun god can be read as the religious equivalent of political reunification. The older sun god, once central to Old Kingdom kingship, may have seemed distant or aged in later mythic imagination after the collapse of that earlier world. joining him with the energetic rising cult of Amun, revitalized the solar tradition without discarding it. The combined deity could be understood as a single power in two aspects: the hidden force behind creation and the radiant force that rules the day. It also provided a national divine figure able to speak to both regions at once: southern Theban authority and northern solar heritage. Pinning down the exact moment this merger crystallized is difficult because the archaeological record for the earliest reigns of the dynasty is patchy. The clearest early proof comes from monuments that already treat Amun and the sun god as a unified presence. Those monuments were created for royal jubilees and state ceremonies, occasions designed to broadcast ideology to priests, officials, and the wider population. By the time these scenes were carved, the fusion was not experimental. It was established enough to be celebrated publicly. Seen as a whole, the story of Amun's rise is not a simple replacement of one god by another. It is a transformation in which a once local Theban deity gathers political backing, absorbs fertility symbolism tied to royal potency, inherits the authority of the northern solar tradition, and emerges as a national divine figure capable of embodying unity after division. The hidden god becomes the god of the state, without losing his defining mystery. And that paradox, unseen yet everywhere, concealed yet central, helps explain why later Egyptians could describe encounters with him in the language of breath and wind, as if the god's presence could be felt even when it could not be seen. When Egypt emerged from the long interval of foreign domination between the Middle Kingdom and the New Kingdom, the religious map of the country snapped back into a familiar shape with remarkable speed. The rulers who drove the foreigners out came from Thebes, and the god most closely tied to Thebes rose with them. Amun joined with the ancient solar tradition in a single, powerful identity. And by the early New Kingdom, this combined deity became the central divine authority of the state. In the 18th dynasty, Amun-Re was not treated as a local patron anymore. He was treated as the god of empire, the supernatural force behind kingship, victory, expansion, and the wealth that poured into Egypt from abroad. Later, royal memory painted the foreign period as a time of disorder in which proper rule had been suspended. One famous queen looked back and described those foreign rulers as illegitimate, claiming they governed without the approval of the sun and without the guiding decree that made kingship valid in Egyptian eyes. That accusation makes sense as propaganda, especially coming from a ruler who needed to defend her own right to the throne. Yet the irony is that many foreign kings adopted the outward language of Egyptian legitimacy. Their royal names often invoked the sun god, and they sometimes used the classic claim of being the divine son of the solar deity. This was not accidental. Any ruler who wanted to appear legitimate in Egypt had to speak the language of Egyptian kingship. The foreigners understood the rules of the game and played along, at least on the surface. What stands out, however, is what is missing. The name of Amun rarely appears in their official royal names. The sun could be claimed by outsiders because it was ancient, universal, and deeply tied to the idea of kingship itself. Amun, by contrast, was the emblem of Theban power. When foreign rulers avoided Amun, it signalled that they were outside the Theban tradition even if they wrapped themselves in Egyptian forms. The Theban princes who survived during the Foreign Age also relied heavily on the old solar vocabulary of rule. Their titles and names frequently drew on the sun god, and only rarely provide clear evidence for Amun's prominence in surviving monuments of that era. Part of the reason is practical. The Great Temple at Karnak was rebuilt again and again, and later construction reused earlier stone blocks like a quarry. Many traces of what early Theban rulers built were dismantled and absorbed into later walls. In addition, the Foreign Age was not a time of unlimited resources. Building continued, but it was not on the same monumental scale as later centuries, which means fewer inscriptions survive to reveal the full picture. Even so, the clues that remain point to continuity in Amun's cult. A leading Theban king near the end of the Foreign Era used one of Amun-Re's most enduring titles, calling him the Lord who sits at the centre of national authority. A military leader's victories were presented not just as personal achievements, but as deeds performed under divine sponsorship. And the temple at Karnak appears again as the place where such victories were meant to be recorded and displayed. That detail matters. It implies that even before Egypt was fully reunited, Thebes had already reasserted its sacred centre, and Amun-Re's temple remained the stage where power was explained and sanctified. At the very start of the new kingdom, the official language becomes unmistakable. One early king, celebrated as the founder of the new era, described himself as the beloved son of Amun-Re in a way that made the relationship sound personal and bodily, not abstract. In the same text, the sun god and Amun appear side by side, almost interchangeable in their protective function. The style is deliberate. Parallel phrases that equate the two divine powers, implying that the hidden god of Thebes and the ancient solar force of the north are now working as one. This is no longer a loose association. It is a fusion presented as self-evident. There is also practical evidence of renewed building and donation to the Theban cult. Quarry inscriptions from the early New Kingdom show stone being acquired for major temples, including work planned for Karnak. Lists of offerings, precious metals, rich stones, luxury materials appear tied specifically to Amun-Re. This kind of inventory is revealing. It shows that the restoration of Egypt after foreign domination was not only military, it was ritual and economic. The new regime poured resources into the god who had carried Thebes through the struggle, and those resources would soon transform Karnak into the largest religious complex the country had ever seen. The ideology did not remain confined to the royal court. In the tombs of high officials, the same pairing of Re and Amun appears, presented as the ultimate vision of the afterlife. To behold the sun at the horizon and to glimpse Amun shining forth. The language treats Amun in solar terms, using verbs typically reserved for sunrise and radiance. That tells a larger story. Amun-Re was not just a royal slogan. It had become the shared religious grammar of elites across Upper Egypt, shaping how people described salvation, divine encounter, and the hope of life beyond death. As the dynasty advanced, Karnak grew with astonishing momentum. King after king added something. Chapels, gateways, halls, pylons, courts, statues, and obelisks. Each addition was a political statement as well as an act of devotion. To build at Karnak was to show legitimacy in the Theban tradition, to advertise loyalty to Amun-Re, and to participate in the machinery of state religion that was increasingly tied to imperial success. One early king erected a refined shrine to house the sacred bark of Amun, the ceremonial vessel used in processions. This was not simply decoration. It provided a home for the god's portable presence, the object through which festivals and oracles could be staged. The next ruler expanded the temple's monumental front, erecting towering pylons and adding a great hall between them. Most significant, he introduced something that carried heavy solar meaning: a pair of granite obelisks. Obelisks were ancient symbols of solar theology, born from an earlier tradition tied to the sun's cult centers. By raising them in Thebes and dedicating them to Amun-Re, the king effectively relocated a classic solar emblem into Amun's domain. The message was architectural. Thebes now held not only political power, but also the visible symbols of the sun's authority. Even rulers with short or poorly documented reigns contributed in surprising ways. Some monuments were dismantled later and reused, which makes their original impact harder to see, but traces remain. Occasionally, archaeology reveals unexpected projects on Egypt's frontiers. Temples built in border towns, decorated with scenes in which major gods present life and legitimacy to the king. These discoveries matter because they show that Amun's reach was not limited to Thebes. The state was pushing its sacred imagery outward, planting royal religion at strategic gates of the land. As Egypt's military expansion accelerated in the 15th century, the link between conquest and Amun-Re tightened into a near formula. Campaigns were not framed as personal adventures. They were framed as actions authorized by the god. Inscriptions describe victories as ordained by Amun-Re, as if the king received marching orders from the temple itself. This language suggests more than piety. It implies a political system in which the temple's authority and the king's authority reinforced each other. The king fought, the god authorized. The king returned with plunder. The god's sanctuary received a share. That flow of wealth into Karnak helped fund the explosive building program that still astonishes visitors today. Some accounts emphasize divine wonders supporting the army. Strange celestial signs that panic enemies, sudden events interpreted as supernatural intervention, victories credited directly to the god's will. Whether modern minds treat these as literal miracles or as rhetorical framing, their function is clear. They announce that the empire is not merely Egypt's strength. It is the god's gift. The conqueror is not only a general, he is the chosen instrument of Amun-Re. Devotion and propaganda reached a peak during the long partnership between a powerful queen and her co-ruler. After a contested succession, the queen needed to convince the country that her kingship was not an anomaly, but a divine plan. The solution was theological theatre on stone walls. A famous narrative was carved in her mortuary temple, showing her conception and birth as a divine event, presenting her as the child of Amun-Re. This was not private mythology. It was public legitimacy written into architecture. If the god is the father, then the throne is hers by nature. At Karnak, her message was reinforced in the most dramatic way possible. Colossal obelisks she dedicated to Amun-Re, coated with gleaming metal so they flashed in sunlight. The imagery combined solar brilliance with Theban theology, a perfect physical expression of the fused deity. Reliefs and inscriptions depicted Amun-Re crowning her and presenting royal insignia, turning the temple itself into a witness of her coronation. Alongside the obelisks, she completed and expanded temple chambers, commissioned shrines, and filled them with scenes of offerings to Amun-Re. Each project repeated the same point from different angles. Her rule was not a disruption of order, but an act of order, sanctioned by the god who now stood at the heart of the state. After her reign, the temple's growth accelerated even further under the king who became the greatest builder and conqueror of the dynasty. He strengthened the sacred core of Karnak, added pylons, raised columns, covered walls with records of victories and gifts, and set up obelisks that would later be carried away to distant lands as trophies of later empires. He also maintained ties with older solar centres, commissioning grand solar monuments in the north even while Karnak remained the engine of imperial religion. The result was a religious landscape in which Amun-Re stood as patron of Thebes, lord of Egypt, and guarantor of conquest. Meanwhile, the empire itself expanded in multiple directions. Early in this king's sole rule, rebellion in the Levant triggered a major campaign, and the victory was framed as fulfillment of Amun's will. Over years of warfare, stelae were erected in distant places to commemorate triumphs. and to credit Amun-Re as the power behind them. In the south, in Nubia, new forts and temples were founded, and Amun-Re's cult was planted beyond Egypt's traditional borders. In that context, the god's status began to sound almost universal. In royal rhetoric, the world was described as everything the sun encircles, and the king claimed authority over that vast circle. It is a sweeping concept. The sun defines the boundaries of the world, and the king, through Amun-Re's approval, claims dominion within those boundaries. That universal language appears repeatedly across the dynasty. Early founders are praised as rulers of the whole world defined by the sun's reach. Queens and kings are promised all lands beneath the sun circuit. Successors are described as destined to govern everything the sun surrounds. This formula matters because it shows how solar language continued to operate even within a religion centered on Amun-Re. The empire's ideology did not abandon the sun. Instead, it folded solar universality into Amun's authority. Amun-Re became the god who commands the sun's world, and the pharaoh became the ruler who holds what the sun circles by decree of the god. A worldview built around a pharaoh who claimed authority over the whole known world needed a god who could match that scale. Amun-Re fit the role perfectly. He was imagined as the meeting point between sky and sun, the hidden force of the air joined to the blazing certainty of daylight. One of the titles attached to him describes him as Lord of the Sky, a phrase that immediately pushes the imagination beyond the Nile Valley and towards something limitless. That kind of language was not used by accident. It carried an imperial message. The god's reach was as wide as the heavens, and therefore the king's reach could be framed the same way. Along Egypt's vulnerable frontiers, that message becomes especially clear. In the far northeast, near the Sinai approaches, temple blocks and decorated architectural fragments show repeated attention to sky language. Amun-Re appears with titles that emphasize the heavens. Nearby, other divine figures connected to the sky show up as well. The great goddess of the firmament, protective powers associated with the vaulted expanse above, and even foreign deities redescribed in Egyptian terms as rulers of the sky. The pattern matters more than the individual names. At the edge of the state, the official religion leans heavily on sky imagery, as if to announce that Egypt's authority does not stop at a border marker or a fortress wall. The sky stretches beyond the horizon, and the empire wants its ideology to stretch with it. This same emphasis continues in the reigns that follow the great conqueror kings. 2 successive rulers remained active in military affairs abroad, sending forces into the Levant and deeper into Nubia. Yet they were far quieter builders at Karnak than their predecessors. Instead of transforming the temple's skyline with new pylons and colossal halls, they focused on selective acts of piety, finishing surfaces left incomplete, decorating inherited columns, and commissioning refined shrines for the ceremonial bark of the god. These were not minor offerings. The bark shrine was central to festival life and divine presence, the object carried in processions and placed where worship could be performed with maximum ritual authority. One shrine in particular stands out because of its wording. It honors Amun-Re explicitly as Lord of the Sky. The divine title and the choice of monument work together, presenting Amun-Re not only as the god of Thebes but as a cosmic king whose domain is overhead and endless. The next ruler followed the same template with an almost matching shrine, and he also built an impressive court structure that once stood before an earlier gateway. That court did not survive intact. Its blocks were dismantled and reused, which was a common fate for older monuments, when later pharaohs remade temple space. Even so, enough remains to reveal the message that mattered. The king is shown embraced by Amun-Re, and the god is identified as king of the gods. That phrase is not decorative, it is a statement of hierarchy. If the god is king over divine powers, then the human king, backed by that god, can stand above foreign rulers without apology. Then comes a long reign in which the empire seems to exhale. By the time Amenhotep III sits securely on the throne, Egypt enjoys the benefits of earlier conquests with fewer major wars. Wealth flows in from vassal states, trade routes stabilize, and the state can invest in display. This is the kind of reign that produces monuments not because it must prove itself in battle, but because it can afford to turn success into stone. Amenhotep III builds on a scale that leaves a visible footprint across Egypt, and later, generations remember him as one of the greatest builders the country ever had. A single monumental inscription from his mortuary complex lists, projects in a way that feels almost like an official inventory of greatness. It mentions the enormous funerary temple on the West Bank at Thebes, but it also points to work that reshaped sacred space on the East Bank, especially the construction of Luxor Temple, dedicated to Amun. It describes a new place designed for divine appearances and royal viewing, a sacred setting linked to ritual display and surrounded by gardens. Even when the precise location is debated, the portrait is vivid. A king crafting ceremonial landscapes, where divinity and kingship could be seen, celebrated, and renewed. He also commissioned a new ceremonial bark for Amun-Re and expanded the temple complex at Karnak with major architectural additions, including an enormous gateway structure that reorganized circulation and sight lines through the sanctuary. By this point, the meaning of Thebes is unmistakable. It is not simply a capital region with large temples. It has become the sacred heart of the empire. Thebes is the holy city where Amun-Re is treated as king of the gods, and the temple complex is where Egypt's wealth is converted into religious spectacle. The towering pylons, colossal statues, and soaring obelisks are not just devotional art. They are the public face of imperial power. Tribute, taxes, and war booty gathered from distant lands end up as stone, metal, and carved narrative in the god's house. Over 2 centuries, the partnership between throne and temple becomes so established that it feels permanent. That is why the next question hits with such force. If Amun-Re stands at the peak of power, holding Egypt and its far-flung territories in a stable grip, how can a new king overturn that system quickly? How can the son of a builder king, raised inside the machinery of this religious empire, decide that the old order must be cut away? When Amenhotep III dies late in his reign, the successor is not the expected crown prince. An older son, Thutmose, had been positioned as a major religious figure, tied to Memphis and the cult of Ptah. Surviving images show him in the dress and role of priestly service. He appears as a young man marked by the sidelock of youth, and another image hints at an early death, presenting him in a funerary form that makes the loss feel sudden. His titles suggest enormous responsibility. Overseer of priests, high priest of Ptah, a specialist in the rites that linked kingship to divine tradition in the north. Yet nothing about what is known of this prince points to a special obsession with solar reform. If he had lived, the religious revolution that followed might never have happened. Instead, the throne passes to the younger brother, Amenhotep IV. The early life of this new king is frustratingly obscure. Like other princes, he likely moved between major royal residences and education centres, learning court ritual, administration, diplomacy, and sacred tradition. Some imagine him growing up close to Heliopolis, where solar theology had deep roots, and they picture the young prince absorbing the language of the sun from early on. It is an attractive idea, especially because Memphis lies within reach of the old solar center, and the geography itself seems to invite contact. But direct contact is not required to explain a solar fascination. Solar thought was everywhere in Egyptian religion. It shaped royal titles, daily temple language, and the imagery of kingship. A prince could learn the power of the sun in Thebes just as easily as in the Delta. In fact, during the later years of Amenhotep III, the royal court shifts strongly toward Thebes and the new palace complex on the west bank. Seal impressions from that palace even mention a residence associated with the king's son, Amenhotep, suggesting the future ruler was present in the Theban environment at a formative time. Meanwhile, Thebes itself had long been saturated with solar elements. The city was sometimes described with titles that echoed Heliopolis, and important priestly offices in the south carried labels that linked them to a southern Heliopolis. The language shows that solar tradition had already been absorbed into Theban religious life. Once Amenhotep IV becomes king, his earliest surviving depictions are surprisingly conventional. A relief on temple blocks shows him in the classic pose of the warrior pharaoh, powerful and muscular in the traditional style. Another official tomb presents him enthroned in a manner that looks almost like a continuation of his father's artistic world. In these scenes, nothing screams radical change. The king looks normal by the standards of court art. The strangeness that later becomes associated with his image is not yet the dominant mode. Yet another tomb provides a clue to the direction of his piety. A damaged but important doorway scene shows him making offerings to major solar gods of the older tradition. A sun disk hovers above as a royal symbol, flanked by protective serpents, and beneath it appears the emblem of the king's spiritual essence, the invisible force that marks him as destined to rule. The presence of that emblem signals something important. This is not a junior king sharing authority under a living father. It is the crowned ruler acting in full religious capacity. In this earliest phase, there is no official exclusion of other gods. Hymns and inscriptions in the same environment still mention traditional deities, and the great Theban god is not yet erased from the public record. Even at a quarry site supplying stone for new temple work, the imagery still includes Amun-Re offering the standard blessings of life, stability, and dominion to the king. That detail is striking because later, both Amun's image and the king's own name would become targets for removal. At this early stage, however, the old and new can coexist on the same monument. Still, a preference is beginning to surface. The gods most prominently honoured by the new king are solar in nature, and they are treated with unusual emphasis. This is not yet the later revolution, but it looks like a tilt of the compass. The sun is being placed at the centre of royal attention, not in a vague way, but through repeated offerings and carefully chosen divine recipients. Another sign of change appears in the king's priestly self-image. At an early moment, he presents himself as the chief priest of a particular solar form, a role that suggests direct personal involvement, rather than reliance on the established priesthood. That is a major ideological move. The traditional system placed enormous ritual power in temples and their professional clergy. When the king calls himself the top priest of the new focus of worship, it hints at a reordering of who stands between the divine and the nation. The king is not just sponsored by the god, he is positioning himself as the primary mediator. Even the name of the new solar focus shows signs of being freshly formed. In one early inscription, the divine name appears in slightly different forms in the same text, as if the language is still settling into standard usage. That kind of inconsistency suggests novelty. Either the formula is still developing, or it is so new that the scribes carving it have not yet mastered a fixed pattern. At the same time, the most famous visual symbol of the later movement, the fully developed image of the sun disk, with rays reaching down to touch and bless, does not yet appear with the dominant seen later. The iconography seems to be in the process of becoming. The quarry inscription does more than mark the start of work. It also explains why thousands of men were sent into the sandstone cliffs in the first place. The stone was being cut for a major sacred feature connected to a new solar focus at Karnak, described in language that links the rising sun, its light, and the visible disk in the sky. In other words, plans were already in motion to install a prominent symbol for this developing cult, inside the most important temple zone of Thebes. Yet at this early stage, the project does not look like a hostile takeover. Nothing suggests that existing shrines were torn down to make room. The new buildings rose on open ground, added beside the older sacred landscape rather than carved out of it. What exactly was being made is harder to pin down. The text could be pointing to a single monumental object, perhaps an obelisk-like marker shaped as a sacred solar stone. It might also be using a revered solar term as the name of a sanctuary. That uncertainty matters because one of the earliest buildings in the new complex at Eastern Karnak carried a name that can be rendered as Mansion of the Benben, a title that deliberately echoes the oldest solar traditions of Heliopolis. The choice is not random. The first major structure of the new program signals a conscious return to an earlier solar vocabulary, the kind that had once shaped royal ideology in the age of the Great Pyramids. It is not yet a break with the past. It is framed as a revival of something ancient and authoritative. A handful of surviving blocks help visualize what this first phase looked like. One sandstone block that reached Europe in the 19th century preserves a scene centered on a falcon-headed solar god crowned by the sun. The surrounding inscription gives the deity an unusually long descriptive name that links horizon, joy, light, and the solar disk. Nearby, the king appears with standard royal titles, shown in an older artistic manner rather than the later style that would become famous. Above, a sun disk floats as a protective emblem, complete with the traditional royal cobras and hanging symbols of life. The overall effect is important. This early moment still speaks the language of familiar solar gods, only now they are being presented through a new, expanded formulation that draws attention to the disk itself. Other fragments from the same building were later found reused inside a massive pylon, suggesting that the early solar sanctuary was dismantled and recycled in a later era. Researchers have been able to match additional pieces to that early block and reconstruct more of the program. The pattern that emerges points to a first temple dedicated not simply to the classic sun god in his normal form, but to a solar power defined by that long descriptive name, a name not clearly attested before this reign. The writing appears again and again on these early stones, and notably, it is often not enclosed in a royal-style name ring. That detail, combined with the physical character of the masonry, hints at a very early phase before construction became standardized. Stone size strengthens the impression. The best-known later building blocks of the movement are small, uniform, and easy to transport in vast quantities. These earliest blocks tend to be larger and less standardized, as if the project began before a fully systematized building method took over. Another striking absence is the queen. In later monuments, she is everywhere, carved beside the king as a central partner in ritual scenes. In the earliest blocks, she is missing. The king alone dominates the imagery, and his depiction still follows older conventions. Many of these royal images were damaged in antiquity, hacked away even before the later dismantling of the structure, a sign that opposition and backlash were already part of the story. There is also a tantalizing piece of evidence preserved only in an old drawing. The original block has disappeared, but a careful 19th century copy records part of a larger theological scene. The drawing shows Shu, the god of air, with his characteristic feather, and Tefnut, his counterpart, standing beside him. The surrounding vertical text includes a fragment of the same long descriptive name used for the new solar focus. What makes this fragment fascinating is that it includes odd spellings and missing elements, as if the scribes were still experimenting or the formula was not yet fixed. Instead of one standardized sacred title, there are variations, and they appear so early that the most reasonable explanation is that the theology itself was still being shaped. The same drawing includes names that reach back into the mythic beginning of the world. References appear to primeval waters and to ancestral divine forces, along with epithets that place Shu in a role tied to the sun god and the ordering of the cosmos. If the copy is accurate, the message is clear. Early on, the new solar direction did not immediately erase the older universe of gods. It could still speak in a many-layered, traditional way. The system had not yet collapsed into a single exclusive focus. The new solar language was being introduced inside a world that still felt populated. Two additional inscriptions from reused temple blocks offer an even sharper window into the earliest doctrine. One identifies the king in a priestly capacity, linked to the long-named solar power, implying that he was not only the political sponsor but also the chief ritual agent. Another preserves part of what appears to be a formal royal proclamation, the kind of statement kings used when launching major building programs. The implication is that this solar power required its own dedicated cult center and its own ritual infrastructure. It was not just a poetic nickname for an older god. It was a newly defined focus that demanded new space, new ceremonies, and new public visibility. At the same time, nothing about this earliest phase came out of nowhere. The disk, the sun's visible circle, had a long history in Egyptian thought long before this reign. Earlier texts used the term for the sun disk simply as sun or disk, a natural way of referring to the bright circle that crosses the sky. Over time, however, language around the disk becomes richer. Middle Kingdom funerary spells begin to treat the disk not only as an object seen in the sky, but as something connected to the sun god's movement, his boat, and even his mysterious origin. In some passages, the disk is paired with the solar bark, the vehicle that carries the sun across the heavens. In others, it is linked to the image of the cosmic egg, the idea that life emerges from a primeval, enclosed form before breaking into the world as light. One of the most evocative descriptions brings these images together. The sun god is pictured as rising from an egg and appearing in his disk, shining in the horizon, moving across the sky like a swimmer in the great expanse. He gives wind with his breath and illuminates the land. When later scholars reflect on this kind of language, they notice something important. The disk begins to feel like more than a simple visual detail. It can function as the place where the sun god appears, the vehicle through which his presence becomes visible. This opens a conceptual door. The disk can be treated as an active manifestation, a powerful sign through which divine force is revealed. Another subtle point emerges from the wording of these earlier spells. The sun god and the disk can be spoken of as if they are linked but not identical. The sun god is described as being in the disk, or as the lord of the disk, or as acting through it. That kind of phrasing suggests a relationship between a divine being and a visible form, between person and appearance, between power and the radiant sign that carries it. Later, developments will push that relationship to the extreme, but the groundwork is visible centuries earlier. By the Middle Kingdom, the disk also begins to appear in royal language that describes the reach of kingship. When kings are praised, The texts sometimes claim that their authority extends over everything the sun disk encircles. The phrase turns the daily path of the sun into a political map. If the sun circles the world, then the king's dominion can be imagined as equally comprehensive. Over the following centuries, this becomes a familiar imperial idea, and it grows stronger in the New Kingdom as Egypt expands beyond its traditional borders. In early New Kingdom praise texts, multiple solar names appear side by side, as if the sun is too complex to be captured by only one form. The king can be compared to the sun god at dawn, to the disc's brilliance, to the scarab-like force of sunrise, and to the creator in the eastern sky. These are not contradictions. They express a world-view where the sun has many faces, many titles, many aspects that overlap. At the same time, the disc continues to appear as a powerful universal symbol, especially in phrases that describe the king ruling all that the disc surrounds. As the 18th dynasty advances, the link between king and disc intensifies. A scene of a ruler pausing, watching the disc in its horizon, captures a new kind of intimacy between monarchy and solar imagery. The disc is no longer only a cosmic marker used in poetry, it becomes part of the emotional language of kingship, a focus of attention that can be described as something witnessed repeatedly, moment by moment. The sun is not just a god in the heavens, it becomes a daily presence tied to the king's identity. Under Amenhotep III, this trend accelerates dramatically. References to the disc multiply across monuments, inscriptions, palace life, military terminology, and even the naming of royal property. The old state religion centered on Amun remains dominant, but the disc's prestige rises within that broader religious ecosystem. The king is praised as brightening the land like a solar power, as shining with rays visible to all, as dazzling like the disc at morning. Sacred boats and cult equipment are described as gleaming in a way compared directly to the disc's brilliance. Even the great festival processions with their gold and silver surfaces catching the sun are framed in language that celebrates radiance, glitter, and the overwhelming presence of light. The disc also becomes a name marker for royal institutions. A yacht can be named after a dazzling Aten. A military unit can carry a title that fuses the king's authority with that same shining epithet. Wine labels and administrative records can mention a House of the Dazzling Aten, a phrase that seems to refer to the royal palace complex or to a significant sector within it. Officials even bear titles connected to this house, showing that it was not just poetic ornament, but part of the real bureaucratic vocabulary of the court. What matters most is the atmosphere these texts create. There is no hint yet of a single god exclusivism. Instead, the period feels confident in its ability to blend traditions. Amun can be honoured as supreme, and at the same time, language associated with the disc can be used to praise royal power, temple splendour, and cosmic creation. The system is expansive, not narrow. It is comfortable describing divine reality through multiple names and images, as though each one adds a different colour to the same blazing sun. This balance is captured beautifully in hymnic language, composed by court officials and craftsmen. Their praise can begin with worship offered to Amun in a shining solar aspect, and then flow naturally into greetings to the disc of daytime as creator and life-giver. The hymn piles up classic solar images: the falcon, the scarab of emergence, the self-creating power that comes into being without human birth, the radiance that fills the sky and brightens the two lands. In that poetic world, Amun and the solar forms coexist without tension. The disc is rising in importance, but it has not become a weapon against the other gods. Seen from this angle, the early stage of the later revolution becomes easier to understand. The disk did not appear suddenly out of nowhere. The vocabulary of the disk as radiance, as universal reach, as creative power, and as a privileged symbol of kingship had been building for centuries. By the time Amenhotep IV begins his first projects at Karnak, he is drawing from a deep reservoir of solar tradition. What is new is not the existence of the disk in Egyptian religion. What is new is the way the disk is framed through an unusually long descriptive formula, the way a fresh cult center is built for it, the way the king places himself in a direct priestly role, and the way the old solar god in falcon form becomes fused with a concept that increasingly points attention to the disk as the defining feature. Early in Amenhotep IV's reign, the first surviving images already reveal a pattern. The young ruler is shown turning toward solar powers, presenting offerings not to a hidden god of a local sanctuary, but to a radiant, sky-centered divinity, praised as the great god and Lord of Heaven. Very soon after, the language surrounding that solar figure expands dramatically. Within a year or two, the same solar name is woven into a new, unusually long formulation that begins to appear on stone blocks from the king's earliest building work at Karnak. It reads less like a simple label and more like a compressed statement of belief, as if the title itself is meant to teach the viewer what the deity is and how that deity should be understood. The choice of that particular solar figure is revealing. This is not merely the sun in the abstract. It is a combined identity that unites the sun with a horizon-focused form of Horus. The idea behind it is straightforward but powerful. The sun is not only light, it is movement, appearing at the eastern edge of the world and vanishing at the western edge, crossing the sky between two thresholds. The horizon becomes the stage where cosmic order repeats itself every day. Long before this king, Egyptian religious language had already linked royal destiny to that daily rhythm. Old funerary spells describe the renewed king receiving mastery over the horizons and travelling the sky road that leads toward the sun. In that worldview, the horizon is not a scenery detail. It is a gateway, and the solar god tied to the horizons becomes the guide across it. That long history helps explain why the horizon sun identity remained attractive for centuries. In later periods, it is often connected with the sun at its strongest, when brightness and power feel overwhelming at midday. By the time of the 18th dynasty, it has become a familiar presence in formal hymns and in royal statements of devotion. Earlier, monarchs had already used it as a divine patron when dedicating monuments or raising obelisks in the north, where the oldest solar cult traditions were rooted. Some kings also invested heavily in the sacred landscape around the Sphinx, treating that monumental guardian as a living voice of solar authority and a protector of legitimate rule. A ruler who was not born the obvious successor could point to a solar revelation, a dream message, or an act of restoration as proof that the throne had been granted by something greater than politics. Against that backdrop, Amenhotep IV's next step becomes clearer. What he does is not to invent solar devotion from nothing, but to tighten it, reframe it, and aim it toward a new focal point. The horizon sun god is paired with the visible disk itself, and the disk is no longer just an artistic feature above a falcon's head. It becomes the heart of a developing doctrine. The earliest reliefs show the falcon-headed solar god seated in authority, holding the standard signs of power and life, crowned with a large sun disk and a royal serpent. The king stands before him in the classic posture of worship. That familiar image is the bridge. Traditional solar iconography is preserved, yet it now supports a new emphasis that keeps steering attention back to the disk and what streams from it. A key phrase in the new long-form title pushes the meaning further. It describes the deity acting in his name through something called Shu. That word carries more than one idea. It can mean the primeval air that holds apart sky and earth, the invisible space that makes breath possible. It can also mean light, especially sunlight, the brightness that fills the world. A third meaning exists as well, but it clearly does not fit a solar creed. The important point is that the ambiguity is not an accident. In the early stages of the king's religious program, imagery connected to Shu appears again and again. Some colossal statues from early in the reign even show the king wearing headgear that echoes Shu's iconography, as if the monarch is aligning himself with the cosmic element that makes life and light possible. Later, however, this ambiguous word is removed from the official formulation. That change is telling. It suggests a shift away from mythic language that might invite older, divine associations. If Shu was understood as a god, it risks keeping the new doctrine tethered to traditional personalities and family trees of gods. If Shu was understood as light, it still risks confusion, because in Egypt light was never merely physics. Light had names, forms, and divine faces. Removing the word helps narrow interpretation. The emphasis can remain on radiance itself without leaving a doorway open to older, mythic identities. In practice, the most natural reading of the phrase points toward light. The developing cult is increasingly obsessed with what can be seen and felt. Brightness pouring into space, the daily flood of illumination that touches everything. Under this view, the new doctrine does not worship a falcon or a mythic figure in the way older religion often did. It elevates the force of light as the primary expression of divine presence. Air and light merge in concept, because air is the invisible medium that allows life, while light is the visible medium that reveals life. The creed-like title seems designed to lock these ideas together. The god is defined as solar power rejoicing at the horizon, known through the light that exists in the disk. A further development appears remarkably quickly. By the end of the third regnal year, the long descriptive name is treated in an unprecedented way. It is split into two parts and placed inside the kind of formal framing usually reserved for kings. That decision is not a mere stylistic experiment. It signals a conceptual leap. If the name is written like a royal name, the being behind it is being pushed toward royal status. The disk is no longer only a symbol above a god's head. It is now presented as a ruling presence, with a title that functions like an official throne name. At this point, the story inevitably brushes against a second, larger question: the role of Amenhotep III, the king's father, in shaping the religious climate that made all of this possible. Late in Amenhotep III's reign, solar language becomes louder, more confident, and more public. The phrase dazzling Aten begins to appear around the time of the Great Jubilee celebrations, and many researchers have argued that the aging ruler's status was elevated in an extraordinary way during those rites. The Jubilee was meant to renew kingship, to restore vigour and legitimacy through ceremonial transformation. In that context, it is easy to see how solar imagery could be intensified. A king who shines, who dazzles, who embodies creative power, becomes an idealized figure of cosmic order, not merely a man on a throne. Some reconstructions go even further. They propose that Amenhotep III was officially treated as a living divine manifestation linked to the disk, and that the new disk-focused cult began as a court-centered veneration of that deified ruler. In this model, the young Amenhotep IV would have launched his program as an extension of his father's transformation, perhaps even sharing power briefly during the final decline of the older king's health. The argument is attractive because it stitches together several realities: the late reign's solar language, the monumental scale of royal ritual, and the sudden emergence of a new cult centre under the sun. Yet the evidence does not force that conclusion. The existence of scenes where a son honours a father does not automatically prove that the father's cult became the engine of a new religion. Royal sons could honour deceased fathers as an act of piety without turning the father into the central object of a revolutionary creed. Also, the larger political claim of a long-shared reign has repeatedly struggled under close scrutiny. Many specialists have challenged the idea of an extended co-rule, arguing that the data can be explained without it. At most, a very brief overlap remains possible, the sort of practical arrangement that might occur when a long-reigning ruler is failing and a successor must begin taking public responsibility. Even that, however, cannot be used as a foundation for explaining the whole religious transformation. A more cautious reading makes better sense of the pattern. Amenhotep III certainly used solar language to praise kingship and to present royal splendour as radiant and world-filling. He may well have been honoured in divine forms and associated with the sun in ways consistent with Egyptian ideas about the king, as a living link between earth and the creative powers of the sky. That would not be unusual. Earlier rulers had already moved in the same direction, sometimes building cult sites linked to solar guardianship, sometimes receiving legitimacy through solar revelation, sometimes describing royal rule as extending as far as the sun's path. But this does not mean that the sun's new cult was simply a private memorial project for his father. The earliest, disk-focused construction at Karnak does not advertise the father as its central purpose. The language and imagery point instead to a new divine focus defined through horizon, light, and the disk itself, staged deliberately inside the sacred territory, traditionally dominated by Amun and his great temple institutions. The early period shows coexistence rather than immediate war against older gods. But it also shows purposeful direction. The king is building a separate cult centre and shaping a new divine identity that is rooted in solar tradition, yet framed as something more precise, more absolute, and eventually more exclusive. In short, the first years reveal a religion being engineered in real time. A familiar solar god becomes the doorway. The disk becomes the centre. Light becomes the message. Old mythic language is used at the start and then trimmed away as the program hardens. Royal-style framing is applied to the new divine name to elevate it into the realm of kingship itself. And while the shadow of a dazzling father may hover over the background, the momentum of the new movement is driven by the sun's construction, imagery, and theological tightening, not by a simple desire to preserve a predecessor's cult. For more than 5 centuries, Thebes had been, in every practical sense, the homeland of Amun and Amun-Re. Karnak was not just a temple. It was a growing city of stone and ritual. During the 16th and 15th centuries before the Common Era, each ruler left something behind there as a public statement of loyalty and legitimacy, and the scale kept rising. New pylons climbed higher than the last. Obelisks pierced the skyline. Sacred lakes, chapels, statues, and long corridors of reliefs turned the landscape into a permanent celebration of Amun's power. In that environment, the priesthood did not merely serve the god. It managed an institution with land, wealth, labour, and prestige that stretched far beyond Thebes. That is why the early building program of Amenhotep IV must have felt like a shock. Instead of adding another monument that fit comfortably within Amun's world, he began planting new shrines and temples devoted to a solar formulation that pushed attention away from the traditional Theban focus. The language attached to this emerging cult was not subtle. It presented a horizon rejoicing solar power, described through the light found in the disk. Even before the later conflict hardened into open hostility, the direction was clear. A new sacred centre was being established inside the very territory that had long defined Amun's supremacy. Almost nothing of those Aten buildings still stands today, and that absence is part of the story. The later reaction against Atenism was not content with criticism. It aimed at removal. The easiest way to silence a religious experiment carved in stone was to dismantle it, carry the blocks away, and bury the images inside new construction. The last king of the 18th dynasty, who had risen from the army, oversaw a deliberate demolition of these solar buildings. Their stones were fed into massive gateway projects at Karnak, and later, rulers continued the practice, recycling more blocks into additional pylons and even into nearby Luxor. To later eyes, it could have seemed that the attempt to erase the Aten episode had worked completely. Temples were gone. The visible memory of the king who built them appeared to have been wiped away. The effort went beyond architecture. Official presentations of royal history were also cleaned and rearranged. Lists of kings in major sanctuaries skip over the Amarna rulers as if the entire sequence never happened, and the dynasty is stitched back together by placing the final 18th dynasty king directly after Amenhotep III. It is a quiet act of censorship with an unmistakable purpose. The line of legitimacy should look uninterrupted, untainted, and safely orthodox. Time, however, has a way of undoing even the most confident erasures. As centuries passed, the great pylons at Karnak aged, cracked, and in places collapsed. When their cores were exposed, the fill material revealed itself, blocks covered in the very images and titles that were supposed to have vanished. Some of the earliest recovered pieces belong to the first shrine Amenhotep IV built, where the solar identity still carried older falcon-headed features. Those stones had been hidden in plain sight inside later walls, waiting for gravity and decay to bring them back. One of the most famous rediscovered pieces entered a private collection in the early 20th century, and later became part of a museum collection in Cambridge. The scene it preserves is striking. The king appears dressed in Jubilee attire and performing rituals normally associated with the renewal of kingship. The surprise is not the Jubilee theme itself, but the timing. In older tradition, the Grand Renewal Festival belonged to a ruler who had reached a long reign. Yet here, the imagery appears very early, hinting at a deliberate choice to present a young king as already entering a phase of transformation and sanctioned renewal. The Aten's long official title is written in royal style, framed like a sovereign name. The text also places the celebration within a Theban setting, described with a solar geographic label that effectively rebrands Thebes as a southern counterpart to the classic northern centre of sun worship. Even the place name language begins to push the audience toward a new mental map, where the Theban landscape can be spoken of as a solar realm. At first glance, a name connected to the later Aten city might seem to point away from Thebes, but the surrounding clues make the origin clear. This is Theban vocabulary, not a northern discovery. Related inscriptions from Karnak reinforce the idea that the phrase is not pointing to the later city, but to a local sacred zone inside Thebes itself. The effect is bigger than naming a single building. It suggests a planned setting, a defined precinct, even a transformed territory. In other words, the king was not simply adding small chapels to a crowded sanctuary. He was beginning to reimagine the Theban religious landscape as a stage for a solar presence that could rival Amun on his own ground. The physical evidence supports that sense of a large and coordinated program. Some blocks linked to the Jubilee scene are limestone rather than the sandstone normally used for the Aten buildings at Karnak. That difference matters. It implies that there were multiple construction phases, or even separate structures with different building materials, not a single uniform project. It also helps explain why later recycling scattered the evidence so widely. Blocks from different Aten buildings ended up inside different pylons. At Luxor, for example, thousands upon thousands of unusually shaped sandstone blocks were found inside a pylon built by a later ruler. They are relatively small and standardized, designed for fast construction and easy reassembly. Modern researchers gave them a special nickname, and the term stuck. Their presence at Luxor once encouraged the idea that an Aten temple had stood there, but the stronger conclusion is that the blocks were hauled from Karnak and reused. Luxor became a convenient storage vault for dismantled history. The first strong clue to where these Aten structures stood in Karnak came not from a grand excavation plan, but from practical engineering. In the 1920s, a drainage canal was cut east of the Great Enclosure Wall. The work exposed an unexpected treasure: colossal statues of the king, shattered and buried. They looked nothing like the idealized royal images that had dominated earlier centuries. The faces were elongated, the jaws sharp, the torsos unusual, the hips wide. One figure even seemed to blur gender boundaries. Whether those traits reflect a deliberate artistic program, a theological message, a political provocation, or something else entirely, has been debated ever since. What is certain is that the statues were found in a context that suggests intentional violence. Many were lying face down, broken in ways that looked like ritual defilement rather than accidental damage. Behind the fallen colossi, the excavators found foundations for large rectangular stone piers. The pattern hinted at a monumental facade, or an open court lined with massive supports, the kind of architecture that could frame processions and royal appearances. The early work in the 1920s did not expose the entire complex. Instead, two wide trenches were cut, one running east to west across the area, another turning north to follow the pier foundations and the trail of statue fragments. Then, attention shifted again to the enormous task of recovering and recording the decorated blocks scattered through later constructions at Karnak and Luxor. Even in those early decades, the numbers grew quickly. Tens of thousands of inscribed blocks were pulled out of later pylons and walls, and the total kept climbing as new work continued. As the documentation expanded, the names of the Theban Aten temples began to emerge from the inscriptions themselves. The blocks reveal a large complex that can be described as the domain of the Aten, within which several distinct temples and shrines had their own names. One of the most prominent names, repeated often, carries the sense of discovery. The wording can be interpreted in slightly different grammatical ways, but the core idea remains. The Aten is found, or the Aten is discovered, or discovery of the Aten. The name reads like a claim that a revelation occurred here, a moment when the solar power disclosed itself, and therefore deserved a cult center on that very spot. This discovered Aten temple is tightly bound to Jubilee imagery. The scenes are filled with processions, ritual movement, and royal renewal. The king and his family appear in ceremonial roles that present the monarchy as revitalized and divinely endorsed. That focus makes sense if the temple was built to stage the king's transformation in public. It also marks a crucial change in iconography. Earlier, the solar concept still leaned on older, falcon-headed forms. In the blocks from this Jubilee-focused temple, the falcon-headed image fades away, replaced by the disk itself with radiating rays. Even the royal cobra changes position. In older solar imagery, the cobra often sits on the edge of a crown or appears as paired serpents, flanking a disk. In the newer Aten iconography, the cobra is anchored beneath the disk at the center, facing outward, as if the disk itself has become a royal being. The long solar name continues to echo the older Horizon language, but now it is presented in a royal format, framed like a sovereign identity. The theology is moving from traditional solar devotion towards something narrower and more exclusive, and the art makes the shift visible. The blocks also preserve the name of another sanctuary inside this solar zone, the House of the Benben. That name is loaded with meaning. The Benben was the classic sacred symbol of the old solar cult in the north, associated with the earliest ideas of creation and with the great temple traditions of the Sun City. To build a House of the Benben at Karnak was not a casual borrowing of an attractive word. It was a declaration that the Aten program was reaching back to the oldest solar language Egypt possessed and transplanting it into Thebes. Even the writing of the name points to solar monumentality, using the sign of an obelisk rather than a more pyramid-like marker. That choice encourages the thought that the cult object here may have been an upright stone, something that catches sunlight and turns it into visible brilliance. There is also an intriguing possibility suggested by the layout of Karnak itself. Long before Amenhotep IV, an enormous obelisk had been erected at the site, one of the tallest ever raised there, a needle of stone visible across the temple precinct. Later, kings treated it as a visual anchor. They built structures aligned to it, framing it so that it dominated sight lines and ceremonial movement. If later, rulers thought it was worth designing around, it is not hard to imagine the Aten builders doing the same. A solar program that prized the disk and the brilliance of light would naturally gravitate toward the most dramatic, vertical symbol of sunlight in the entire complex. Even if the original position of that great obelisk is still debated, the basic logic holds. The Benben idea, the obelisk form, and the Theban Aten precinct belong to the same visual and theological world. If the great obelisk raised under Thutmose III and later emphasized under Thutmose IV really became the visual anchor for Amenhotep IV's House of the Benben on the east side, a stubborn mystery immediately appears. A massive Benben-shaped monument was quarried at Gebel el-Silsileh in sandstone, yet no intact monument matching that description has ever turned up. So what happened to it? Several scenarios fit the evidence without forcing a single, neat answer. One possibility is that the Silsileh stone belonged to an earlier, more modest installation, perhaps a first attempt at marking a new solar focus inside Karnak. If so, it may have been overtaken by a larger, more ambitious plan once the king's building program accelerated. In that case, the original cult object could have been set aside, left unfinished, dismantled, or simply absorbed into later construction as the project evolved. Another possibility is more deliberate and more interesting. The earlier stone was not abandoned at all, but was integrated into the newer structure. It could have been set so that it pointed toward the towering Thutmoside obelisk, or aligned in a way that made the older obelisk the target of approach, sightline, and ceremony. That kind of design would turn an existing solar monument into the centerpiece of a new solar precinct, without the need to erect an even larger replacement. This logic matches a wider pattern at Karnak. The approach from the east was not random. The east side functioned like a ceremonial corridor, and an obelisk placed on that axis could dominate the experience of arrival. If the older obelisk already drew the eye and shaped movement, a new temple in that zone might have been designed specifically to heighten the drama around it. In that reading, the reference to a great Benben from the quarry may point less to a brand new giant monument and more to an architectural program that reoriented attention around what already stood there. It could mean the new solar project was meant to create a setting where the existing obelisk suddenly mattered more than ever. Still, the frustrating conclusion remains. The sandstone monument itself has never been identified. What has been found, however, are hints that small obelisks existed within the Aten precinct. More than a century ago, a fragment of a pyramidion, the capstone of an obelisk, was recovered at Karnak. It was granite rather than sandstone, and the surviving text is broken, preserving only part of a place name that links the object to a solar named Zone in Thebes, described as a southern counterpart of the traditional sun center. The missing section would have told the most important detail: the name of the monument or the sanctuary where it stood. But that portion is gone. Based on the size of the fragment, the obelisk it crowned would have been relatively small, not the colossal Ben hinted at in the quarry record. The find is also hard to evaluate, because early reports did not include the kind of detailed photographs that would settle questions about whether the king's name was carved originally or recut later, something that happened to many reused blocks. An equally revealing development is the way temple names and ideas migrated from Thebes to the new Aten city. The House of the Benben did not remain a strictly Theban label. At Amarna, the principal sanctuary that modern visitors call the Great Aten Temple carried more than one formal designation, and one of them reused the Ben language. The same solar vocabulary that had been planted inside Karnak was exported and rerouted on the new site. That transfer matters because it shows the concept was not an accidental local experiment. It was part of a portable program, a style of sacred architecture and naming that could be moved and repeated. The Amarna version of the Ben-associated sanctuary also contains a striking twist in the relief program. In key ritual scenes, the queen and her eldest daughter appear as the visible celebrants, while the king is absent in ways that are difficult to ignore. The simplest explanation would be that the surviving scenes are selective or incomplete, yet the pattern is consistent enough to raise real questions. Why would a temple shaped by the oldest solar symbolism, the kind of symbolism normally tied tightly to kingship, place such emphasis on the queen's ritual profile? The answer is not obvious, but the broader picture of the early years helps. In Thebes, relief counts and scene distributions already suggest that the queen was displayed with extraordinary frequency. The imbalance is so strong that it points toward political weight as well as religious role. In the same early phase, her name was expanded, with an additional epithet linking her identity more directly to the Aten. From that point onward, she carried a longer form of her name that became standard during the Amarna years. A public signal that she was not merely present, but central to how the new order wanted to be seen. Alongside the large name temples, the blocks preserve the names of smaller installations inside the wider Aten domain. One of these appears to have been a compact shrine described in terms that evoke a booth, canopy, or tent-like structure. In older Egyptian religious practice, such booths could be associated with sacred processions and specialized rites, including funerary contexts. But here the usage is adapted to the Aten setting. The avoidance of certain traditional words in the naming of this shrine may reflect a preference for a vocabulary that kept older divine labels at arm's length. Even if the shrine itself remains architecturally elusive, the inscriptions hint that it functioned as a defined ritual station, and the queen's presence on blocks naming it suggests that she had a formal relationship to its ceremonies. Another named structure appears far more substantial. Its title declares that the monuments of the Aten endure forever. This is not the name of a minor kiosk. The frequency of the name on blocks and the nature of its scenes point to a major temple, possibly independent of the Jubilee-focused enclosure, though connected to the same ceremonial world. The scenes reconstructed from matched blocks repeatedly show the king before dense arrays of offerings. Bread piled high, food arranged in abundance, vessels lifted in formal presentation. What stands out in some compositions is the king's posture. Instead of turning upward to the disc, he faces forward, directing the offering outward in a manner that feels staged for an audience. In other scenes, rows of braziers sit on stands, stacked register upon register like an engineered forest of fire and smoke. Attendants fan them, managing heat and flame, while the royal procession has already passed, leaving the equipment and the activity behind as part of the ritual machine. Chariots appear as well, not as decoration, but as narrative. The royal party arrives, ceremonies happen, and the vehicles mark the movement of power between palace and temple. A final named temple is attested less often, yet its surviving scenes are unusually rich. Many blocks from this sanctuary show domestic production, integrated into sacred presentation. Bread being made, wine being stored, animals managed, water carried, kitchens working. The temple reliefs treat these activities as part of the ritual ecosystem, rather than as background. A reconstructed scene assembled in modern times captures the basic atmosphere. The king approaches a shrine doorway, while the Aten disc stretches down rays that end in hands holding signs of life and power. A priest opens the door, allowing the king to advance to the offering table. One recurring figure bears a title associated with the highest priestly authority of the old northern sun center, a detail that quietly ties this new Theban solar world back to older traditions. In adjacent panels, offerings are stacked with almost overwhelming abundance, and flame bowls burn above them as the rays reach down to the altar. Above, a frieze of cobras raises hands in adoration, a motif that echoes very ancient protective symbolism and makes it look as if the architecture itself is worshipping. These temple scenes also point to a nearby palace, or at least a palace-like ceremonial complex. Early in his life, the king had resided in the enormous Western Palace zone, built under his father, where seals and impressions attest to royal apartments and court administration. Under the new reign, the official palace name language shifts towards solar phrasing, describing rejoicing in a horizon. Yet the reliefs carved on the temple blocks suggest something closer than the Western palaces. A residence connected directly to the Aten precinct. The scenes show an architectural feature known from royal ceremonial life, a window of appearance where the king could display himself, reward officials, and perform public gestures of authority. One famous tomb scene in Thebes preserves exactly such a moment. The king and queen appear in the window while the Aten disc shines above. The setting is described as inside the Aten domain, implying that this window belonged not to a distant Western palace, but to a structure integrated into the temple landscape. The chariot imagery reinforces this. The reliefs repeatedly show the royal household travelling between the residence and the temples, or waiting chariots standing ready as if the palace and shrine formed two poles of a single daily rhythm. This is the same basic pattern later displayed in Amarna tombs. What is missing in the Karnak palace scenes is just as revealing as what is shown. There is plenty of labour, plenty of kitchens, plenty of storage and movement, but no clear emphasis on sleeping chambers. That absence suggests a ceremonial residence rather than a fully depicted domestic home, a place designed for public transformation, banquets, costume changes, and ritual staging, especially during renewal celebrations. For a long time, the Aten precinct at Karnak was known mainly through scattered blocks and shattered statues. Then, in the mid-1970s, systematic fieldwork returned to the east side of Karnak with a simple strategy. Start where earlier excavators had left visible scars and trace what could still be followed on the ground. The area had suffered from erosion, vegetation, and decades of dumped debris. But once cleared, the old trenches and the traces of walls reappeared. South of a major wall line, a thick mud brick enclosure was uncovered, likely part of the boundary system that framed the temple zone. New decorated blocks came up from the soil, and their themes were unmistakable. Jubilee processions, attendants bowing, men carrying the king's portable platform, and the long Aten titulary carved in royal fashion. A fragment even preserved the name of the central Jubilee temple itself. In that moment, the scattered data snapped into place. The wall, the Colossi, and the Jubilee scenes belonged to the same enormous enclosure. Further seasons exposed corners of the temple's perimeter. A rounded, corner moulding element marked an exterior angle, confirming the line of the wall. The scale soon became the dominant fact. As excavation followed the perimeter northward, a second corner appeared hundreds of meters away. The enclosure was not a small add-on. It was vast. The eastern boundary, however, remained uncertain for years because modern villages encroached on the area where the wall would have stood. The footprint of the temple seemed destined to remain incomplete. Then, unexpectedly, modern infrastructure work solved what archaeology could not. During trenching for a sewage system in the early 21st century, new sections of the Aten precinct emerged in the gaps between villages. Supervised handling and careful documentation revealed wall remains, pillar bases, and more decorated blocks with Jubilee themes. Granite altars appeared as well, bearing royal names, the Queen's name, and the Aten's formal titulary in its royal presentation. Even fragments of the same colossal statue type, found decades earlier, reappeared, including pieces of a royal beard and kneecaps. When the new points were plotted against the known western corners, the geometry became clear. The enclosure was essentially square, roughly 220 meters on a side. When the thickness of boundary walls is considered, the complex becomes even more imposing. The implication is hard to overstate. This was a construction on a scale comparable to the main Amun precinct, yet created in a remarkably short span of time. It did not merely challenge Amun symbolically, it challenged Amun spatially, architecturally, and institutionally, planting a rival sacred world in stone at the edge of Karnak, and tying it to a royal ceremonial residence. From that point forward, the conflict was no longer only theological. It was physical, visible, and built into the ground. With the newer excavation results added to the earlier finds, and with the carved scenes on the Talatat used as a kind of visual blueprint, the shape of the great Aten court at Karnak finally becomes easier to picture. This was not a dark, maze-like sanctuary of inner rooms. It was a vast, open enclosure designed for sunlight. A tall, decorated wall of sandstone blocks formed the perimeter, and along the inside ran a line of pillars. In front of those pillars stood the colossal statues of the king. A slim roof strip likely bridged the gap between the outer wall and the inner colonnade, creating a narrow band of shade, while the main ceremonial imagery appears to have been placed on the inner faces behind the statues. The result was a deliberate stage, monumental bodies at the edge, inscriptions on pillars and walls, and in the middle, a huge court left exposed to the sky. Inside that colonnaded space, the Talatat scenes suggest an environment crowded with cult equipment, rather than crowded with buildings. Altars were set out across the open ground in large numbers, arranged so offerings could be made under direct sunlight. Smaller chapels may also have stood within the court, and several stone features of this kind are known, including pieces made in granite. The older solar phase also left traces of a large altar associated with the falcon-headed solar god, approached by a ramp and a structure of that type would fit well inside an open court built for processions and public ritual. Similar ramped and stepped altars continued in use later at Amarna, showing that this was not a one-time experiment, but a preferred design. At Karnak itself, a stepped altar still stands that resembles what the reliefs show, yet its date remains uncertain because it carries no surviving inscription that would fix it to one reign or one moment. This architectural logic matters because it explains what made the Aten precinct feel so different from the traditional temple world around it. Earlier, Egyptian solar sanctuaries had also emphasized open-air worship, and the Aten buildings revived that principle in an extreme form. Ritual was moved into direct contact with sunlight. That choice created a sharp contrast with the enclosed, shadowy interiors where other gods were normally served, especially the great local deity whose Karnak temples were famous for deep corridors, dark chambers, and sacred spaces that were not meant to be flooded with daylight. One discovery on the west side of the great enclosure revealed something even more telling. At the midpoint of the western wall, the line breaks and turns outward, forming a controlled entrance system. The same pattern continues: decorated walls, pillar bases, and the avenue framed by colossi. The passage between the two sides is narrow, more like a ceremonial corridor than a wide gateway. It runs westward for a short distance, then the trail is interrupted by a modern canal cut through the area in the early 20th century. Beyond that gap, another stretch of the same wall system was found farther west, confirming that the approach originally extended toward an important destination. The most likely candidate is the ceremonial palace that appears again and again in the reliefs. This was not simply a random walkway. It was a planned route that led from the Aten precinct toward a building where the royal household could appear, move, and perform a public authority. A palace location has been proposed north of the main Aten court, between major sanctuaries that already existed in the Karnak zone. The distance and layout match the idea of a ceremonial residence connected to the temple by a formal approach. In that model, the court and its colossi formed the sacred focus, while the palace served as the administrative and performative companion, close enough to support constant movement between daily life and public ritual. Even with the massive square enclosure, now mapped and understood, the positions of the other named 18 temples remain harder to pin down on the ground. The inscriptions and reliefs make it clear that multiple sanctuaries stood in the Karnak area and very likely in the immediate neighbourhood of the Great Open Court. But archaeology has not yet provided unmistakable foundations for each named building. That gap in the evidence has encouraged several reconstructions. One influential model placed an early solar pylon aligned with the enormous Thutmoside obelisk deeper inside the Amun precinct, and set the house of the Benben nearby, favouring the idea of a deliberate visual axis between a Benben monument and the great obelisk. The sightline concept is attractive, but parts of that older reconstruction depended on an early misunderstanding of the western entrance. Later discoveries showed that the main walled approach was not offset toward the southwest corner, as first suspected. It sits at the centre of the west wall and runs straight out to the west, changing how any map should place gates, pylons, and the flow of processions. Some reconstructions also place a major Aten temple west of the great enclosure, aligning walls and imagining a neat geometric plan. Yet that kind of layout sometimes leaves the ceremonial avenue pointing into empty space, with no palace at the end, which is difficult to square with the reliefs that repeatedly show a residence closely tied to the temple precinct. An alternative proposal treats the palace as the organising centre, with the other temples clustered around it. In that arrangement, one sanctuary would sit to the south, another to the north, and the house of the Benben would occupy a zone between the palace and the west side of the great open court. This proposal also includes the idea of water access, a canal leading from the Nile to a harbour and quay, allowing boats to bring officials and supplies directly to the ceremonial heart of the complex. Hard evidence for the canal inside Karnak is still missing, but the concept fits the practical needs of a large court that required constant deliveries and staged movement. The question of why a Jubilee festival dominates the decoration of the great open court is just as important as where the building stood. In Egyptian kingship tradition, the said festival was normally linked to a 30-year reign and was meant to renew the ruler's power as age advanced. Later, Greek descriptions even preserved the idea of a 30-year marker. Yet in the Karnak Aten complex, Jubilee scenes appear at a surprisingly early stage, and the timing is difficult to ignore. The strongest clues are the royal children. Several daughters appear in the Jubilee processions, carried in formal display. That detail suggests the celebration occurred only a few years into the reign, because one of the youngest daughters would still have been extremely small at the time. This points to a date around years 4 or 5, before the move to the new city in year 6. So why hold a renewal festival decades early? That question has produced many theories. One older line of thought looks beyond Egypt to broader patterns of royal ritual, where a leader's vitality is tied to the land's prosperity. In that way of thinking, renewal ceremonies can be performed not only because a ruler is old, but because stability and fertility require public reassurance. In Egyptian history, there are also examples of kings who did not reign for 30 years, yet still held Jubilee rights, suggesting the festival could be triggered by circumstances rather than by a calendar rule. Another explanation tries to connect the early Jubilee to the unusual way the king is represented in later art. The argument claims a crisis of legitimacy existed, and the festival was a tool to silence doubts and assert fitness to rule. It is a clever narrative, but it rests on shaky foundations. Evidence for a long overlap of reigns between father and son remains uncertain, and no clear proof exists that the king's later exaggerated appearance was a medical portrait, rather than a symbolic, artistic program. Even more important, there is no solid basis for assuming that bodily difference would have disqualified an Egyptian king or priest in this period. Egyptian priestly purity emphasized cleanliness and ritual preparation, but the idea that a physical condition automatically barred temple service is not supported by clear New Kingdom evidence. In fact, other royal mummies show that some pharaohs lived with real physical problems, while still holding full kingship and cultic roles. If those rulers were not blocked from sacred duties, it becomes difficult to argue that an early Jubilee was a desperate attempt to compensate for disqualification. A different group of theories ties the early Jubilee to the father's regnal timeline, suggesting the son's festival was timed to mirror the father's later Jubilees, especially if some overlap existed between their reigns. Yet that approach tends to lean heavily on a co-regency that remains unproven, and it often pushes the interpretation toward a father-centered cult explanation that goes further than the available evidence requires. A more revealing clue comes from the way the Aten is described in the inscriptions. Some texts speak of the Aten as being in the said festival, and later versions expand that idea into titles that treat the Aten as the Lord of Jubilee rights. That language has encouraged the suggestion that the Jubilee belonged primarily to the Aten rather than to the king. There is a striking relief in which the rays of the sun end not only in signs of life and power, but also in symbols that express an overwhelming abundance of Jubilee celebrations. The scene presents the festival as something granted, downward, from the solar presence. In that logic, the king receives renewal from the Aten, and the ceremony simultaneously elevates the Aten's status through public celebration. This interpretation also solves a larger problem. The Jubilee scenes show that only one divine power presides. Earlier Jubilee traditions often included a crowd of gods acting as witnesses. In the Aten court, that assembly disappears. The Aten alone fills the role of divine witness and divine source of legitimacy. The strongest sign of what was happening comes from writing practice. In the earliest stage of the reign, the Aten's long descriptive title appears without the full royal framing later used. Then, in the Talatat temple phase, that same extended name is placed inside royal cartouches, the visual device normally reserved for kingship. In Egyptian tradition, enclosing a name in a cartouche is not a casual decorative habit. It marks sovereign status. When gods receive that framing, it is because they are being presented as rulers in the most literal sense. The change tells a story. The Aten is no longer treated as a solar aspect among others. The Aten is being written as king. Once that move is understood, the purpose of the early Jubilee becomes clearer. The festival does not have to be explained as a response to the king's age, or as a private anxiety about legitimacy, or as a tribute to a deified father. It can be read as a public mechanism for establishing a new hierarchy at the heart of the state. The Aten is proclaimed as the supreme sovereign of the cosmos, and the human king is positioned as the Aten's unique representative on Earth. Royal language reinforces the relationship. The king maintains the traditional son of the sun identity, but now the son relationship is tightened into an exclusive bond with the Aten. In inscriptions where the cartouches of the Aten and the king appear together, the divine name often dominates visually, while the royal name appears at a smaller scale, like a subordinate signature beneath a greater authority. From this perspective, the Jubilee celebrated at Karnak around years 4 or 5 served two goals at once. It staged the Aten's kingship as absolute, and it staged the king's role as the Aten's chosen agent. Instead of a political co-rule between two human monarchs, the imagery points toward a symbolic co-rule between the solar sovereign and the earthly ruler. That same moment may also explain the shift in the king's own public name. The earlier birth name honoured the old patron of Karnak, and later inscriptions show it being erased and replaced with a new name built around usefulness to the Aten. This change appears across many blocks, even on early material, suggesting that the renaming decision was made after some building and carving had already begun, and then implemented aggressively through recutting. That pattern fits a sequence in which the temples and their Jubilee program were nearing completion or already functioning, and the ideological transformation demanded that older royal identity markers be stripped away and replaced, not only in theology but in stone. A Jubilee was never just a celebration. It was a carefully staged reset of kingship, and one of its central gestures was a symbolic return to the moment a ruler first became king. In the classic idea of coronation, the royal identity was not treated as a private choice. The new ruler's full set of throne names was announced as if it had been granted from the divine realm, then recorded as permanent truth in the language of sacred writing. A royal scarab preserves a version of this memory for Amenhotep IV, presenting him as a ruler whose fame was already wide, whose official names carried religious weight, and whose right to rule was secured in the most traditional way imaginable. It even ties his legitimacy to Heliopolis, the old centre of solar tradition, by placing the decisive act of royal confirmation at the sacred tree associated with kingship and cosmic order. That detail is not random. It fits the broader pattern of how this king's public image increasingly leaned into solar language and ancient sun-linked customs. In later periods, Jubilee reliefs make the connection between festival and coronation unmistakable. In those scenes, the king is shown receiving renewed authority, as if he is being crowned again, and the ceremony is framed as a divine endorsement that keeps the monarchy alive for the future. That is precisely why the Jubilee would have been the perfect stage for a radical shift in royal identity. If a name was going to be proclaimed as the name that would define an era, a Jubilee offered the most powerful setting for it. The festival's visual language also highlights what is missing in the early Aten period. Under normal circumstances, coronation scenes often show a major god physically placing the crown upon the king's head. That familiar motif is largely absent from the Jubilee scenes, carved for Akhenaten in Thebes. Instead, the new solar symbol takes over the role. The rays of the sun end in hands that reach toward the king and queen, and in several scenes those hands close around the crowns as if the act of crowning itself has been transferred from a temple god to the sunlight that dominates the composition. It is an artistic change with ideological teeth. The source of kingship is being rewritten in stone. This shift becomes even clearer when the long-running debate over an extended overlap between Amenhotep III and his son is brought into the picture. Some reconstructions claim that the father and son shared power for many years, that their jubilees overlapped, and that the son's religious program unfolded while the father continued to rule and build on a massive scale. But the practical burden of that scenario is immense. A jubilee required extraordinary resources, careful planning, and a large administrative machine to coordinate manpower, materials, ritual equipment, and elite attendance. To imagine two jubilees being executed in parallel, one centered at the Western Palace and one centered at Karnak, while the older king's monumental projects across Egypt and Nubia were still being completed, and while the younger king was simultaneously launching a huge new temple precinct and then beginning work on an entirely new city, stretches logistics beyond what feels plausible. Even without touching the political arguments, the sheer organizational load makes a long overlap difficult to accept. The carved evidence inside the Aten precinct strengthens the doubt. The major Jubilee-focused temple at Karnak is saturated with the new solar theology. Yet it does not feature the older king's name or image as a central presence. If the younger king's cult had truly been designed as a public devotion to a deified father, this would be the place where that message would be expected to appear most clearly. Yet the reliefs and the massive collection of inscribed blocks from the Theban Aten buildings do not advertise such a father-centered cult. Even where the older king is honoured later at Amarna, the language does not reliably match the idea that he was the core of the Aten program. The Theban festival imagery is focused on the living king and the solar power he promotes, not on the memory of his predecessor. A simpler reading fits what the stones actually show. The Jubilee at Karnak was a public declaration that the king's bond with the Aten had become the foundation of the state's ritual life. The relationship is presented as exclusive, and the solar power is elevated to a level that had previously been associated with the greatest gods of the land. The absence of Amenhotep III from the Jubilee imagery also suggests a straightforward sequence. The older king likely died before the decorative program of the Theban Aten precinct reached its climax, and before the festival was staged in its most elaborate form. The architecture of the temple complex creates the stage for one of the most startling visual programs ever produced in Egypt, the colossal statues of Akhenaten. When these giants were first uncovered in the 20th century, the reaction was immediate fascination mixed with confusion. They were unlike anything expected from Egyptian tradition, and yet they made sense when compared to the odd, artistic style already known from reliefs. Although none of the statues survives fully intact, enough fragments exist to reconstruct their scale and their deliberate placement. They were carved in sandstone, stood roughly the height of a small building, and once formed an imposing ring along the court, stationed against rows of pillars and lining a formal avenue that led outward from the temple enclosure. The count is difficult to finalize, but the spacing of the pillar bases suggests dozens upon dozens, potentially over 100 if all sides carried similar lines, even where later destruction erased the northern side more thoroughly. The remaining evidence still points to a carefully planned forest of royal bodies turning the outer edge of the court into a monumental barrier of kingship. Additional pieces found in later excavations confirm that the Colossi were not limited to one spot, and that the wider Karnak area held more royal statuary linked to the Aten precinct. Fragments associated with the queen also appear, and in other temples nearby, pieces of royal sculpture likely displaced from the Aten domain turn up again, as if the later effort to dismantle the heresy scattered the remains across the sacred landscape. Some statue bases preserve the feet of the queen and the smaller feet of royal children, hinting at family scenes rendered in stone at a monumental scale. A provocative proposal has been raised that at least some of these colossi began life as statues made for Amenhotep III, and were later reworked for his son. The argument points to signs of recutting and to odd details like traces that may suggest a changed body plan during carving. One detail often mentioned is the appearance of more than one navel shape on certain fragments, as if an earlier form was covered and reshaped. Other marks have been interpreted as further evidence that sculptors modified existing royal stone rather than carving every figure from scratch. The idea is intriguing, and it would fit the broader Egyptian habit of reuse in certain contexts. Yet without an unbroken chain of archaeological certainty, from original placement to later recarving, the argument remains suggestive rather than settled. It explains some features well, but it cannot be treated as proven fact. Regardless of their origin, the Colossi communicate a clear message through their pose and their regalia. Many show the ruler with arms crossed, holding the crook and flail, a posture commonly associated with Osiris and with themes of renewal and rebirth. That association is not accidental. The Jubilee itself was a renewal ritual, and the Osirian posture carries the visual idea of regeneration. At the same time, the details do not simply copy divine imagery. The beard often resembles the squared beard of a living king rather than the curled divine beard typical of gods like Osiris, suggesting an intentional blend. Human kingship framed with the symbolism of eternal renewal. The crowns vary, sometimes dramatically, and that variety appears to be part of the program. Different combinations of headgear and diadems reinforce the sense that the king embodies multiple royal roles at once. Yet one motif is remarkably consistent: the cobra sign of sovereignty at the brow. Even when other crown types differ, the sign of royal power remains fixed in place. Just as important as the pose is the way the colossi are covered with the name of the Aten. The royal body becomes a billboard for the solar sovereignty. The Aten's long formal name appears in royal cartouches, not only on temple walls, but across the king's sculpted flesh, on armbands and chest areas, and sometimes in multiple placements on the same statue. The repetition is not decorative excess. It is an ideological statement in material form. The king is saturated with the identity of his god. The Colossi insist that the ruler's authority is inseparable from the Aten's kingship. This is the visual version of the same logic seen on temple inscriptions, where the divine name dominates, while the human king's name appears as secondary, smaller, and dependent. Not all the colossi fit neatly into one category, and one particularly strange statue has fueled debate for decades. This figure appears almost nude, with no clear belt line, and without explicit sexual anatomy. The impression is deliberately ambiguous. Some have argued that the statue might represent a royal woman, possibly the queen, with certain masculine elements such as a beard added in a different way than on the other colossi. Others see it as an experimental attempt to translate the new two-dimensional style into full sculpture, a trial that may have been deemed unsatisfactory and therefore not repeated. However it is explained, the statue intensifies the central question. Why is the royal image so feminized in this period? One strong interpretive line suggests that this was not meant to describe the king's body, but to express theology. If the Aten is presented as a creator who does not require a female partner, then the king's image may have been designed to visually echo that self-sufficiency by blending masculine and feminine traits into a single sacred body. In that reading, the strangeness is not a medical record. It is symbolic language. That theological angle becomes even more complicated when an entirely different kind of object enters the discussion. A statue sometimes claimed to represent the Aten in human form. This piece is unusual because the head is not a human head with a solar disk above it. The disk itself becomes the head. The figure holds a scepter, wears a male sheath garment, and shows a strongly built chest, creating a strikingly virile presentation. One interpretation has tried to read the statue as a kind of visual wordplay, combining the disc, the garment, and the scepter into a message about life and power. It is an ingenious reading, but it remains speculative, and the problem is serious. The statue lacks secure archaeological context. Without a reliable find spot, it is difficult to anchor the object to a precise moment, a specific temple, or a defined stage in the development of Aten imagery. Another interpretation sees it not as the Aten at all, but as a more traditional solar god rendered in an unusual way, and points to missing details that would normally be expected if the figure were meant to be the Aten in its later canonical form. Even if the statue is set aside, it does highlight an important tension. Some imagery from the early Aten period emphasizes softened, feminized royal traits, while other solar imagery, whether Atenist or not, emphasizes raw male potency and strength. That contrast suggests that multiple symbolic languages were in play, and not all of them can be reduced to one neat formula. The debate over Akhenaten's appearance also inevitably drifts into the medical realm. Over the last century, scholars and physicians have offered a long list of conditions to explain the king's exaggerated portrayal. Hormonal disorders, inherited syndromes, and connective tissue diseases among them. Some proposals focus on features that seem visible in the art, such as elongated faces, heavy-lidded eyes, narrow shoulders paired with fuller hips, and long limbs. Certain syndromes can be described in ways that appear to match some of these traits, making the medical explanations sound persuasive on paper. One theory emphasizes adolescent breast development. Another points toward genetic conditions associated with long faces and other body proportions. A frequently discussed possibility is a connective tissue disorder that can produce tall stature, slender build, elongated extremities, spinal issues, and facial characteristics that could be read into the reliefs. Yet caution is essential. Egyptian art is not a neutral camera, and the Amarna style is famous precisely because it rejects older norms. The figures were shaped to express ideology, intimacy, and a new concept of the royal body. The earliest images of Amenhotep IV as king show him in a more traditional physique, and the extreme style develops and intensifies as the new religion is being proclaimed. That sequence alone makes a purely medical explanation risky. The art may exaggerate, stylize, and symbolize far more than it records. It is entirely possible that the body in the Colossi is a theological body, built to communicate a doctrine rather than a diagnosis. At the same time, it is also true that real medical conditions existed in royal families, and later, evidence from mummies shows that physical ailments did not necessarily prevent kingship. That reality complicates any argument that tries to turn unusual art into proof of impairment or exclusion. The safest conclusion is not that Akhenaten was certainly ill or certainly healthy, but that his images were designed to shock and to persuade. They broadcast a break with a past so radical that even the shape of the king's body was rewritten. In the open-sun courts of Karnak, surrounded by rows of towering colossi, marked again and again with the royal cartouches of the Aten, the message would have been unmistakable. A new kind of kingship had arrived, and it intended to be seen. The idea that a single inherited condition could explain Akhenaten's strange physical portrayal once seemed persuasive, especially when modern readers compare the long limbs, narrow torsos, and unusual facial proportions in Amarna art to known medical patterns. But that explanation has weakened sharply since a large-scale scientific investigation focused on the royal family associated with Amenhotep III. Using modern imaging and genetic testing, a broad team of specialists examined several mummies linked by family ties, including the older king himself, close relatives, and individuals whose identities have long been disputed. The results were published in a peer-reviewed medical context and then summarized for a wider audience, and the overall impact was immediate. Many of the dramatic syndromes proposed in earlier decades could no longer be defended with confidence. At the center of this debate stands the enigmatic burial known as Tomb 55 in the Valley of the Kings. Since the moment it was found in the early 20th century, the tomb has produced more arguments than certainty. The burial assemblage contains objects tied to royal women, and some items appear to have been made, originally, for a queen before being altered. Early on, this mixture of equipment encouraged the belief that the occupant might have been female, or that the burial had been rearranged in a confusing way during a time of crisis. Later, anatomical examination of the skeleton overturned that first assumption and confirmed the body was male. Even the coffin itself tells a story of reuse. Its design features point to an origin intended for a woman, and then a royal emblem was added so that it could serve a king. Over time, different candidates were suggested for the identity of the tomb's occupant, including a short-lived successor and Akhenaten himself. The dispute persisted because the most straightforward labels were missing. Royal names had been deliberately removed, a mask had been torn away, and decorative elements that might have carried identification were damaged or extracted. The pattern of destruction matters. The removal of names and precious materials was not random looting. It fits a broader campaign to erase memory and to break the symbolic power of the Amarna regime. Some pieces connected to the burial were even stolen in modern times and only later resurfaced in museum collections after a complicated journey through private hands, highlighting how fragile the evidence can be even today. Yet despite the damage, traces remained. The tomb still preserved objects associated with Akhenaten's circle, and some of those objects retained his name. That is significant because one rival candidate for the burial is difficult to anchor there with equal clarity. When a tomb contains repeated links to one king, but no secure trace of another, the balance of probability shifts. Some of the strongest clues come from protective equipment intended specifically for a royal burial. Among the ritual items designed to guard the deceased, are inscribed objects that carry a form of the king's official name used during the Aten period. These pieces were meant to function as magical defences placed in the tomb, and their inscriptions are not casual labels. They are part of the burial's core religious technology. When that kind of material points toward Akhenaten's identity, it becomes harder to argue that the burial belongs to someone else unless equally strong evidence appears to counter it. Additional objects tied to royal women also preserve the same cluster of names and formulas associated with Akhenaten's reign. Even where figures were erased, certain written elements survived, as if the attackers were targeting images and gold surfaces more than carved wording on wood. That uneven survival allows the modern reconstruction to move forward. The scientific study added another layer. Genetic analysis indicated that the male in Tomb 55 shares the same paternal line as Amenhotep III and Tutankhamun. This does not automatically write a name on the mummy, but it tightens the circle. It places the Tomb 55 individual within the immediate royal family rather than in a distant branch. In that context, Akhenaten becomes a very strong candidate, especially when the surviving inscriptions from the tomb's objects already lean in that direction. The same research also confronted the medical theories directly. Many of the diagnoses once proposed to explain the Amarna look were not supported by the anatomical and genetic data. That conclusion is important because it forces a change in how the art is read. If the king's appearance in sculpture and relief cannot be pinned to a dramatic, inherited disorder, then the strange bodies and faces are more likely to be deliberate visual choices. That does not mean the mummies were perfectly healthy. Imaging revealed real physical conditions. Signs consistent with spinal curvature appeared, and evidence for a cleft palate was reported. These findings remind us that royal bodies could carry medical issues like any other human bodies. But the key point is scale. The kinds of conditions detected do not neatly match the full suite of exaggerated traits seen in the art, and they do not explain why the entire royal family is often drawn in the same stylized manner. A single medical explanation struggles to account for a whole artistic system. The more plausible conclusion is that the style itself is doing most of the work. For many scholars, that conclusion is not surprising. A long tradition has argued that the Amarna look should be read symbolically. The king's body becomes a vehicle for ideology rather than a portrait in the modern sense. The mixture of masculine and feminine traits, the softened contours, the unusual proportions, and the intense emphasis on certain features can all be interpreted as visual theology. In this view, the ruler's form communicates something about the Aten as creator, a power that generates life without a partner, containing within itself the capacities normally divided between male and female. That idea was suggested early, even by some of the people closest to the first discoveries of the Karnak Colossi. Yet the statues still carry the king's name, which prevents the simplest claim that they are literal images of the Aten alone. The Colossi are royal images, but they are royal images shaped by a new religious message. Attention has also turned to the crowns and headdresses worn by these statues, because the variety appears intentional rather than random. Several of the headdresses include tall feathers associated with Shu, a primeval figure linked to air, space, and the light that fills the world between earth and sky. That detail matters because the early formal name of the Aten includes a phrase that can be understood as light within the solar disk, and the term involved also echoes the name of Shu. When the king is shown wearing Shu-linked elements, it may be a sign that the early Aten theology still drew on older cosmic concepts, rather than cutting itself off completely. Some reconstructions go further and suggest a matching pair. Shu represented through the king's symbolism, and Tefnut represented through the queen, reflecting complementary forces in creation. This kind of interpretation has the advantage of explaining why certain crowned forms appear, why the iconography leans into cosmic language, and why the royal couple is presented as a central axis of the new cult. But caution is necessary, because these theories sometimes rest on uncertain identifications. A single unusual statue that appears sexually ambiguous has often been used as the centerpiece for bigger claims about the queen's role or about deliberate hermaphroditic symbolism. Yet that statue lacks an explicit personal name, its crown does not survive, and its distinguishing features may reflect experimentation in carving rather than a fixed theological code. Some scholars argue it represents the king, like the other colossi, simply rendered in an extreme way. Others think it may point to the queen, but the evidence is not decisive. A sober reading acknowledges the temptation to build a grand system from a fragmentary object and resists turning a broken statue into a complete doctrine. The safest position is that symbolic intention is likely, but the exact decoding remains elusive. That uncertainty is not a failure of interpretation so much as a reflection of the evidence. The colossi were attacked and broken, their context was disturbed, and the surviving pieces do not preserve a single explanatory inscription that tells the viewer how to read the body. The result is a field of possibilities rather than one final answer. Even after decades of study, no universal consensus exists on the precise meaning of every feature. What can be said with confidence is narrower but still powerful. Egyptian art was designed to express religious and political ideas, and the sudden transformation of the king's representation aligns closely with the transformation of the king's religion. The temple decoration from the Theban phase supports that connection. The theology can be read not only in what appears but also in what disappears. The most striking silence is the near absence of Amun's name in monuments built within the broader sacred landscape dominated by Amun's cult. Where the king's earlier birth name contained an element honouring Amun, that element was often erased and replaced later, as if even the older name became unacceptable once the Aten program hardened. At the same time, Rehirakti remains embedded in the Aten's long formal title and is written again and again across blocks and statues. Yet the image of Rehirakti as a falcon-headed god, prominent at the very start of the reign, fades almost completely from the later Theban Talatat decoration. Only a handful of tiny examples survive, small enough to suggest that the older form was being deliberately minimized, even while the words remained. What stays is the disk itself. The solar orb with streaming rays becomes the dominant sign of divinity. The rays end in hands that reach toward the royal couple, offering life and power, touching crowns, hovering over altars, and filling the open courts with a visible, almost physical presence. This is a crucial shift. The divine is no longer presented primarily as a human or animal-bodied god, standing inside a shrine. The divine is presented as light, contact, and radiance made visible. Other surviving sacred images in the Theban Aten period tend to be creatures and emblems long tied to solar tradition, such as the royal cobra, the sphinx, and other solar-associated animals. They function less like independent gods with their own stories, and more like solar symbols orbiting the new center.